A scream tore through the snow. Not a human one. Numb fingers still gripped the frozen rim of the water trough. The woman stood dead, still in the yard, head bowed against the wind. Because no rider with any sense would be out on a night like this, unless he'd had no choice at all. The wind changed pitch, lower, closer. Past the cottonwood fence line, a bay mare had planted her feet and refused to take another step, sides heaving, reins dragging loose through the drifts. And the thing across her saddle wasn't sitting. It was hanging. One boot still caught in the stirrup. Blood, dried black, ran the length of one trouser leg, dark against all that white. The kind of blood no blizzard puts there. The lantern dropped from her hand. Light rolled sideways across the snow. She knelt, pulled the frozen scarf back from a stranger's face. The wind came first, before the snow. Before anything else, the wind, low and steady across the stone hollow basin, testing every gap in every wall it could find. Cora Hartwell heard it change. Not louder, different. A shift in pitch that meant the storm behind it was closer than the sky let on. She stood at the west window with a rag still in her hand, the one she'd been using to wipe down the lamp glass, and she watched the tree line go gray, then gone. Because that was how it started out here. Not with thunder, not with warning. Just the world closing its fist around you, 1 degree at a time, until you looked up and realized the road was already buried, and you hadn't noticed the exact moment it disappeared. She was 29 years old, alone, had been alone since September, since her father, Elijah Hartwell, had gone quiet in his sleep one night and simply not woken up in the morning, and the ranch had passed to her the way weather passes over a field, without asking, without waiting for her to be ready. His coat still hung on the peg by the door. She hadn't moved it, told herself there wasn't time, told herself a coat on a peg wasn't sentiment. It was just a coat, and taking it down felt like a decision she wasn't prepared to make yet. His mug sat on the shelf above the stove, chipped on one side, and she drank from a different one every morning, because that mug wasn't for using anymore. It was for looking at. His chair by the stove sat angled toward the door. The way he'd left it the last evening he was alive turned like he expected someone. She'd never turned it back. Some nights she caught herself glancing at it out of habit, the way you glance at a person who is no longer in the room, and every time, for half a second. Her chest did something complicated before her mind caught up and reminded her. He's not coming back through that door. Outside, the cattle were already pushing into the lee of the barn wall, backs to the wind, heads low. Good. They knew. Animals always knew before people did, and Cora had learned a long time ago to trust a spooked herd over her own reading of the sky. She banked the stove, checked the shutters on the north side twice, because the north side was where the cold found its way in, always had, ever since her father built this cabin with his own hands, and never quite got that one wall square. She twisted wool into the gap along the sill, pulled her coat on, told herself the cattle needed water, and that was the whole reason she was going back outside. Not because staying in with an empty chair and a chipped mug and a coat on a peg had started to feel like too much silence for one room to hold. The spring box had been slowing for 2 days. She'd have to break the ice at the trough again. She crossed the yard with her head down, wind cutting sideways, snow not falling so much as traveling, flattened and driven parallel to the ground like something being chased. She reached the trough, broke the skin of ice with the heel of her boot, watched the water shiver black beneath it, and that was when she heard it. A horse, screaming, not the ordinary complaint of an animal annoyed by weather. This was different, sharp, terrified. The kind of sound that came from a creature that understood, in whatever way horses understood things, that it might be dying. Cora went still. No rider with any sense would be out in this, which meant whoever it was hadn't had a choice. She should have gone back inside. That was the sensible thing. The thing her father would have told her to do. Wait it out. Don't go chasing sounds into a storm that's already swallowed the road. She knew that. She thought it clearly, in words, standing there with her hands still numb around the trough's icy rim. And then she was already moving. Because that was the other thing about being alone on a ranch for 3 months. You stopped waiting for someone else to decide whether a risk was worth taking. You just took it and dealt with what came after by yourself, the way you dealt with everything else by yourself since September. Hinch. She grabbed the lantern off its hook inside the barn door, looped a rope over one shoulder, pushed back out into weather that had in the last 5 minutes gotten considerably worse. The horse was at the cottonwood fence line, past the north pasture, and by the time Cora reached it, her lashes were crusted and her breath had turned to ice against her scarf. A bay mare, pressed hard against the rails, reins dragging loose through the snow, sides heaving. She could have run. Nothing was stopping her. The gate was open enough, the fence low enough in that section, and a horse in that much distress would normally bolt for anywhere that wasn't here. She hadn't. Cora understood why the moment she got close enough to see the rest of it. A man, hanging sideways out of the saddle, one boot still caught in the stirrup, which meant every step the mare took dragged him, which meant the mare had stopped taking steps, had planted herself, and simply refused to move again. Not for the wind, not for the cold, not for anything. Because something in her animal brain had decided that running would kill the thing tangled in her stirrup, and she would not be the reason. Cora had cried over less sentimental things than that. She didn't have time to now. She set the lantern in the snow. Went to the man first. His shoulder sagged wrong, badly wrong. The kind of wrong that told her everything without her needing to touch it. Blood, dried black, ran the length of one trouser leg. His gloves had frozen stiff enough that she could hear them crack faintly when she lifted his hand to find a pulse. There, faint, uneven, but there. Don't you dare, she said, out loud, to nobody, to the storm, to the man who couldn't hear her. Don't you dare do this on my land. She didn't know where the words came from. They came out anyway, sharp, almost angry, the way fear sometimes came out of her, sounding like fury instead. She couldn't lift him. Not alone, not in this wind, not with him half frozen and hanging at that angle. So she did the only thing that made sense, tied the rope around his chest, ran it over the saddle horn, used the mare's own weight, standing steady now that Cora had a hand on her neck, to take some of the man's weight off the trapped boot. Easy, Cora murmured to the horse this time. I've got him. I've got him now. The boot came free. He slid down slow instead of falling, which she counted as a mercy, because falling from that height in this cold might have finished what the storm had started. Wind hit them both like a wall the second his body left the saddle, and Cora spread an old feed sack over a scrap of canvas she kept by the fence for exactly this kind of nonsense, rolled him onto it, and began to drag. It took longer than it should have. Everything did, in weather like this. Distance stopped meaning anything. The porch, which, on a clear day, was maybe 60 yards from that section of fence, became a country she had to cross one aching step at a time. Rope biting into her palms even through her gloves, the man's weight dead and unhelpful behind her. The mare followed as far as the gate. Stopped there. Waited. Cora got the barn door open first. Led the mare in, got her stripped of tack fast, threw a blanket over her because the poor animal was shaking, and then went back for the man. By the time she dragged him over the cabin threshold, firelight reaching out across the doorway to meet them, fresh blood had soaked clean through the dressing that wasn't there yet, through his trouser leg, dark against the pale wood floor. The cold, Cora thought, wasn't the thing that was going to kill him anymore. She worked fast, cut the frozen cloth away from his thigh, with her father's old skinning knife, the blade thin enough to slide beneath fabric without opening skin further. The wound was deep, ugly, but when she pressed 2 fingers near it, watching, waiting, the blood didn't pulse out at her in that rhythmic, arterial way that meant a man had maybe an hour left in him. That gave her time, not comfort. Time. She boiled water, let it cool enough not to scald raw tissue. Washed the wound clean of dirt and old blood without digging into it, because digging was for someone who knew more than she did, and she knew enough to know the limits of her own knowledge. Clean cloth went over it. She pressed until the worst of the bleeding slowed to seeping, then bound it tight. His shoulder worried her next. Sat wrong in its socket, the kind of wrong she'd seen once on a ranch hand who'd been thrown from a green colt, and she remembered enough from that day to know that forcing it back into place, without knowing exactly what she was doing, could tear something worse than what was already torn. So she left it, folded a strip of wool into a sling instead, bound his arm against his body snug so it couldn't shift and do further damage on its own. His coat, soaked through, came off next. Dry wool went on in its place. Quilts, all of them, every one she owned, piled over him, near the stove but not against it, because a man that cold could take a burn from heat he couldn't even feel yet. She wrapped stones from the hearth in cloth, tucked them along his sides, his chest. When his eyes fluttered, unfocused, and his throat worked at nothing, she spooned warm broth into him a little at a time. Careful, patient, the way you'd feed something wild that didn't yet trust the hand doing the feeding. Only then did she pull her coat back on and go check the mare. The barn was quieter than the cabin had been. Just breathing. Hers, the mare's, the low creak of a structure holding against wind that wanted very badly to get inside it. Cora ran her hands down each of the mare's legs, found nothing broken, nothing torn, just cold and exhaustion, and pushed hay into the manger for her. "You did good," she told the horse quietly. "Whoever he is. You did good bringing him here instead of running." The mare didn't answer, obviously. Just chewed. But something in Cora's chest loosened slightly anyway, the way it sometimes did when she talked to animals instead of people. Because animals never asked her how she was holding up since her father died, and she never had to lie to them about the answer. Before dawn, the man opened his eyes. Cora was sitting near the stove, close enough to watch him breathe, far enough that she wasn't hovering, and when his eyelids cracked open and found the low orange light of the fire, something in his face loosened, just for a moment. He breathed out, long, like a held thing finally set down. Then his eyes closed again. She stayed until his breathing settled into something even, something safe enough to leave for a few hours. Then she looked across the room, at her father's chair, still angled toward the door. For the first time since September, another man was sleeping under this roof. She wasn't sure what to do with that thought, so she didn't do anything with it. Just banked the fire lower, pulled a quilt over her own shoulders in the chair beside his, and let exhaustion take her under before her mind could keep circling the idea any longer. The storm held Stone Hollow Creek for 3 days. Snow buried the road entirely, piled over the lower fence rails until the pasture looked like something out of a dream, all soft edges and false ground. Dangerous to walk without knowing exactly where the fence line ran beneath it. There was nowhere to go. Nowhere either of them could go, which meant, for 3 days, Cora Hartwell shared her father's cabin with a stranger she'd pulled half dead out of a blizzard, and neither of them had any choice about it. By the second morning, he could stay awake long enough to speak. "Name's Nathaniel Cole," he said, voice rough as old rope, eyes tracking her across the room like he was still deciding whether she was real. "Been trading horses, breaking them, mostly. Moving between camps." A pause. "Wasn't expecting the storm to catch me that far from anywhere." Cora set a bowl of broth beside him. It caught most people. "You're not special in that." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, maybe, worn down by pain and cold into something smaller than it might have been otherwise. "No," he agreed. "Suppose not." He didn't offer much more than that. Just his name, his trade, the barest shape of a life spent moving. Cora didn't push. She answered his few questions the same way, short, unembellished, because some part of her understood, without being told, that this was a man used to giving away as little as possible. He didn't need many questions to understand the cabin, though. That was the thing that struck her, watching him those first 2 days. He noticed the way his eyes moved across the room and caught on details she'd have thought a stranger, especially one half dead from blood loss, wouldn't have the presence of mind to register. One plate sat apart from the others on the shelf, never used, never touched. Her father's saddle, gathering dust in the barn, visible through the cracked door whenever someone went in or out. The ranch ledger, open on the table where she'd left it the night before the storm hit, its entries stopping abruptly in mid-September and picking up again in a different hand, a smaller and more careful hand, several days later. He didn't ask about any of it out loud. On the third day, when she opened the ledger again to check winter expenses against what little cash remained, he caught sight of one figure before she closed the book. $3,160. Written in red, underlined twice, the kind of number that sat in a ledger like a stone in a shoe. His eyes flicked to the haystack visible through the window. Smaller than it should have been for a ranch this size, heading into a Montana winter. He didn't say anything about that either, but she saw him do the arithmetic behind his eyes, saw him arrive at some private understanding of exactly how much trouble Stone Hollow Creek was in, and she felt, for one unguarded second, something close to exposure. like he'd read a letter she hadn't meant to leave lying open. "You're doing sums," she said. Not quite an accusation. Not quite, not one either. "Habit," he said. "Man who trades horses learns to read a place fast, whether it's flush or hurting." "And which is this?" He looked at her steadily. "Hurting, but not broke. Not yet." She didn't answer that. Closed the ledger instead, a little harder than necessary, and went to check the fire. By then, he'd also noticed the loose brace on the north barn wall, visible through the same cracked door, groaning faintly whenever the wind gusted hard enough. The cold slipping in along the northwest sill of the cabin itself, the one she'd packed with wool but never fully solved. The broken latch on the feed chest, which she'd been meaning to fix for 2 weeks and simply hadn't found the hours for. His left arm was useless, bound tight against his ribs, but his right still worked fine. On the third afternoon, while Cora was outside breaking ice at the trough again, he found a scrap of hardwood by the woodpile and carved a new catch for the feed chest using her father's knife, one-handed, slow, careful. The kind of careful that came from a man who'd had to relearn doing things one-handed before and knew exactly how much patience it required. When he was done, he reached for the auger resting on the workbench, the one that had sat there, untouched, since September. His hand stopped an inch from it. Cora, coming back in with her arms full of split wood, saw him hesitate, saw the question in the set of his shoulders, even before he turned to ask it. "May I?" 2 words? That was all. But something in the careful way he asked, the way he'd stopped himself before touching a dead man's tool without permission, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected to be hit. She looked at the auger, then at him, nodded. That evening, she served supper without mentioning the repaired latch, without saying anything at all about the auger or the careful way he'd set it back exactly where it had been, angled the same way, resting on the same worn spot on the bench. But she gave him more broth than she had the night before. He noticed that too. Outside, the wind kept pressing at the walls, testing, searching for weakness, the way it always did. Inside, the silence between them didn't feel like something that needed fixing. It sat there, comfortable in its own strange way, 2 people who'd been handed each other by a storm, and didn't yet know what to do with the arrangement, except let it be what it was. On the 4th morning, the wind dropped. Blue showed through the broken clouds for the first time in days, thin and pale but real. The Judith Basin began to emerge from beneath the white, the way a face emerges from beneath a blanket, slow, uncertain, blinking into light it hadn't seen in a while. Nathaniel tested his shoulder before breakfast. Winced. Held it anyway. "Still hurts," he admitted, when Cora looked at him from across the room. "But I can hold reins. The pass may look open before it is," she said. "I know it." He didn't look away from her when he said it. "Got horses promised along the Fort Benton route. A buyer waiting on me. Man like that doesn't wait forever. Find someone else to buy from soon enough." Cora understood that kind of obligation better than most. A promise made was a promise you kept, in this country, or you didn't survive long enough to make another one. She didn't ask him to stay. She wanted to. The wanting surprised her, arrived without permission, sat in her chest like an uninvited guest she hadn't figured out how to ask to leave. But wanting wasn't asking, and she'd learned the difference a long time ago, mostly from watching her father want things his whole life and never once say so out loud. Nathaniel saddled the mare slowly, working mostly one-handed, his bad arm still bound tight against his ribs. Before mounting, he crossed to the barn one more time, drove a second spike into the loose north brace, tightening the timber, though both of them could see it was a temporary fix at best. "That brace needs more than one nail," Cora said, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed against the cold. "I know." There was nothing else to settle after that. He swung up into the saddle, favoring his good side, and the mare stepped through the gate and turned toward the Basin Road without needing to be told which way. He never looked back. Cora stood in the doorway until horse and rider became a small dark shape against the endless white, and then a smaller shape, and then nothing at all, swallowed by distance, the way everything eventually was out here. She went inside before the shape fully disappeared, told herself she had chores, told herself the fire needed tending, which was true, and had nothing to do with the sudden strange hollowness of a cabin that had, for 3 days, held a second heartbeat in it. Later that afternoon, checking the barn, She found the hammer he'd used to drive that final spike. He'd returned it to its place on the bench, exactly where her father had always kept it, beside the auger. Cora stood there a long moment, looking at the two tools sitting together the way they always had, the way they had for years before September, and something about the sight of it, so ordinary, so exactly right, made her chest ache in a way she didn't have a name for. She picked up the hammer, moved it to the other end of the bench, told herself it didn't mean anything. The ranch went quiet again after that. Properly quiet. The kind of quiet that had lived in the cabin since September and had only briefly, strangely, been interrupted. Nothing important had changed. There were still cattle to feed, ice to break every morning at the trough, wood to cut, fences buried under snow that would need digging out before spring, turned the drifts to mud and made the work twice as miserable. The work didn't care who was there to do it, and yet he had left small things behind him. A new catch on the feed chest that closed with one push instead of three. A hammer she kept meaning to move back, and somehow never did. Each repair on its own had saved only a few seconds of frustration. Together, over the following days, they added up to something harder to ignore than she wanted them to be. One evening, ladling stew from the pot into a bowl, Cora reached without thinking for a second one. Filled it, too. Her hand stopped, mid-air, steam, rising off two bowls of stew while the fire cracked behind her, and the cabin sat as empty of anyone but herself as it had every night for months before this one. She stood there a long moment, looking at the second bowl. Then she poured it back into the pot, washed the empty bowl, dried it, set it on the shelf above the others, next to her father's untouched plate, two small monuments to two absences she hadn't asked for and couldn't quite explain to herself. Morning came cold, as it always did, and work answered it, as it always did. She chopped ice from the trough, checked the thin trickle, still moving through the spring box, worried it would freeze solid before the worst of the season hit. Measured the haystack again and did the math she already knew the answer to, then reduced the cattle's ration slightly because a smaller ration eaten now was better than none eaten later. Deadfall came down from the cottonwoods on a rope, hauled by hand across drifts that swallowed her to the knee. Pregnant cows were checked twice daily, morning and dusk, because a calf lost to cold in February was a calf that could sink the whole operation. Her gloves split at the fingers, and she mended them with waxed thread by lamplight, because new gloves weren't in the ledger this year. The old draft mare needed extra feed. The north brace, the one Nathaniel had reinforced with a single spike before riding out, creaked louder every time the wind picked up, and Cora knew, the way she knew most things about this land, that it would need real attention before the deep cold set in for good. Winter had no particular interest in who had stayed and who had gone. It pressed forward regardless. By dusk most days she was still outside, shovel in hand, clearing another ridge of drifted snow from in front of the barn door so the cattle could reach shelter. Behind her, through the cabin window, one clean bowl sat alone on the upper shelf, and some nights, coming in half-frozen and bone-tired, she caught herself glancing at it before she could stop the habit. January arrived hard. February arrived worse. Cold settled over Stone Hollow Creek and refused to leave, the kind of cold that got into a person's joints and stayed there, that turned every chore into something requiring twice the effort for half the reward. The spring-fed trough narrowed a little more each morning, ice creeping in from the edges, until some days only a thin ribbon of open water remained at the center, barely enough to serve the herd if she brought them in small groups instead of all at once. She learned that the hard way, the first week of February, when she let too many cattle crowd the trough at once and watched, helpless, as the meager flow emptied faster than the spring could replenish it. After that she brought them forward in twos and threes, patient, watchful, the ration of water as carefully measured as the ration of hay. Then one of the calves went down. She found it trembling in the corner of the barn, one bitter morning, legs folded beneath it, breath shallow and quick. She moved it to the spot with the least draft, spread dry hay thick beneath its small body, and laid an old wool blanket over its back, tucking the edges in the way she remembered her father doing once, years ago, over a calf she could no longer clearly picture. That night, the north wall groaned. Loud. Wrong. The brace Nathaniel had warned her about, and reinforced with only a single spike out of necessity, had loosened again under the weight of accumulated ice and relentless wind. Cora went out into the dark with a lantern and found a length of cottonwood pole, wedged it diagonally against the frame for extra support, and drove an iron spike home with more force than elegance. The work was rough, ugly, even by any standard of proper carpentry, but it only had to hold. That was all she asked of it. Past midnight, the wind shifted, and cold air began cutting directly across the corner where the sick calf lay. Cora hung a reed mat between two support posts, blocking the worst of the draft while leaving a gap above it, because sealing the space completely would trap damp air in with the animal and do as much harm as the cold itself. She'd learned that from her father, too, from watching him, all those years, solve 100 small problems exactly like this one, without ever once explaining out loud what he was doing or why. She checked the calf twice more before dawn. At sunrise, it pushed its front legs beneath its own body, wobbled, then stood. Cora watched, breath held, until it took its first uncertain steps toward its mother. Only then did she let herself exhale. She pulled the wool blanket free, carried it out into the pale morning light, and hung it over the corral fence to dry, already turning her mind to the next task. Because there was always a next task, and there always would be, for as long as she stayed here alone. By the end of March, winter began, grudgingly, to release its hold on the lower meadow. Snow withdrew first from the south-facing ground, exposing dark, ragged strips of grass along the slopes that faced the sun longest. Stone Hollow Creek grew louder every afternoon, as meltwater came pouring down off the ridges above, filling the air with a sound Cora had missed without quite realizing it. The particular music of water moving. Instead of sitting frozen and silent under ice, she began finding work that didn't require mittens for the first time in months. At sat outside the barn some afternoons, mending harness leather in weak but genuine sunlight, feeling something in her shoulders loosen that had been clenched since November. The cattle spread out across the meadow, grazing at whatever green had begun pushing up through last year's dead grass. Mud replaced packed snow around the corral, and water found its way through places that had been frozen solid and impassable for the better part of 5 months. Near the barn, runoff began collecting in a shallow depression beside the buried water conduit, the covered channel that fed the spring water toward the trough. Cora noticed it before noon one clear day, standing at the edge of the wet patch, with her arms crossed, studying the way the ground held moisture longer than it should have. She cut several willow switches from along the creek bank and pushed them into the soft earth to mark the boundaries of the wet ground. The soil around the buried conduit was holding more water than she liked the look of. It would need real attention once things dried out enough to dig properly, but for now she simply watched and waited and filed the problem away, with all the others waiting their turn. A few days after that, she found the first prairie crocus of the year, opening pale and improbable on a sun-warmed bank above the creek. She cut several stems, carried them home cradled carefully in one hand, the way you'd carry something you weren't entirely sure was real. Inside the cabin, she opened the east window, a crack for the first time since autumn. Cool spring air moved through the room, gentler than it had any right to be, after the winter they'd just survived, carrying none of the hard-biting edge of the months before. She filled a small jar with water from the pitcher and set the crocus stems inside it. For months, one clean bowl had sat alone on the upper shelf where she'd placed it back in November, a small, useless monument to a supper she'd almost served to no one. She looked at it now, reached up, moved it aside, just slightly, just enough to make room. Then she set the jar of crocuses in its place, where the morning light, when it came, would reach them first. She didn't examine too closely why that particular arrangement felt like it mattered. Some things, she was learning, were better left unexamined, at least for a while, at least until spring had fully arrived, and the ground had thawed enough to bear the weight of whatever she'd have to face standing on it. By early April, the basin road had begun to reappear through the last dirty gray banks of retreating snow, and one particular afternoon, Cora Hartwell was sitting outside the barn with a breast strap laid across her knees, working a stiff needle through even stiffer leather, when she heard it. Hoofbeats. She kept working, told herself it could be anyone. A neighbor passing through, checking a boundary fence, nothing that concerned her. Then a second rhythm joined the first. Then a third, slower, weighted down beneath some kind of load. Cora stopped the needle halfway through the leather, holding it there, not breathing, Listening the way you listen, when part of you already knows, and the rest of you hasn't caught up yet. The first shape to appear on the basin road was a bay mare. The same mare that had carried a half-frozen, bleeding stranger to her gate the previous November, screaming into a storm because she refused to abandon the man tangled in her stirrup. This time she came at an easy walk, ears forward, unbothered, carrying a rider who sat tall and steady in the saddle instead of hanging sideways out of it. Cora rose slowly, the breast strap sliding off her knees and onto the ground, forgotten. Nathaniel Cole, leaner than he'd been in November. His face darker, weathered by months of sun and open road. His left shoulder, she noticed immediately, moved freely now. No sling, no careful protection, just an arm doing whatever an arm was meant to do. Behind the mare came a stout dun mare, sturdy and broad-chested, and behind that, a pack horse loaded with rolled canvas and bundled supplies. Nathaniel reached the gate, stopped outside it, didn't open it himself. For several long seconds, neither of them said anything at all. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. The dun mare shifted her weight, hooves squelching faintly in half-thawed mud. "The road opened yesterday," Cora finally said. "I rode fast." His eyes moved briefly toward the barn, toward the north wall, where she could see even from here that the reinforced brace still held. He didn't say anything about it, didn't need to. Cora looked past him instead, at the canvas rolls tied behind the pack saddle, at what she could see peeking through, gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. Iron strap, an auger bit, new, still shining, a crosscut saw, sacks of salt and coffee, a smaller bag she recognized by shape as seed grain. Then she studied the dun mare properly. Broad through the chest, strong-legged, calm-eyed in a way that spoke of good handling and careful selection, not luck. A working animal, chosen with real thought behind it. "Whose mare is that?" Nathaniel rested one hand on his saddle horn. Didn't quite meet her eyes when he answered. "Yours, if you'll have her." Cora looked at the mare again, then back at him. No. He waited. Said nothing. "I can't pay for her. I'm not selling her. That makes it worse." He didn't argue that point either, just stood there, letting the silence stretch, and Cora lowered her hands slowly to her sides. "I don't take charity." His eyes moved across the ranch behind her while she said it. The reinforced north wall, the fresh earth she'd packed over part of the waterline in February, the fence rails she'd reset along the meadow by herself, one aching post at a time through the coldest months of the year, without a single extra pair of hands to help her. The place was worn, weathered, but it hadn't been sitting idle, waiting for him to return and rescue it. "You kept me alive," he said, quiet. "I remembered what needed doing. That's all that was. The debt was paid the day you rode out of here breathing." That seemed to land somewhere. He was quiet a moment, jaw working slightly, and the wind moved lightly through the cottonwoods while the dun mare lowered her head to crop at a patch of new grass near the gate. "All right," he said finally, looked at the canvas of tools, then back at the dun mare. "I need board. A few weeks. The mare can cover part of that. Supplies cover the rest." A pause. "I'll work while I'm here. For wages, for meals, for a place to sleep, nothing more than that." Cora studied him long enough that the dun mare shifted one hind foot, restless. This was different from what he'd offered before, standing there trying to hand her a horse she hadn't asked for. This could be measured, weighed. Work had a value that could be tallied honestly. Same as feed, same as tools, same as a roof over a man's head, for however many weeks he intended to stay. "And when the work's even," she said slowly, "you'll tell me." "I will." She looked past him again, at the sagging section of gate she'd been meaning to fix for weeks, at the willow stakes still marking the wet ground beside the waterline, at everything that needed doing and would take twice as long with only her own two hands to do it. There was more work here than either of them could finish alone, quickly or otherwise. She walked to the gate. Nathaniel stayed where he was, watching, saying nothing, letting her make the decision without pressure from him, one way or the other. Cora lifted the wooden latch, pulled the gate inward. Only then did the bay mare, followed by the dun and the loaded pack horse, step through onto Hartwell land. Cora stepped aside, made room for all three animals to pass. Nathaniel dismounted at last, boots landing solid in the mud, and for a moment they simply stood there, facing each other across a gate that had been, until 60 seconds ago, closed. "Barn's this way," she said, and turned. and didn't wait to see if he'd follow, because some part of her already knew that he would. They began that same afternoon with the closest problem at hand, which turned out to be the north barn brace, still holding on its single hastily driven spike from February. Nathaniel crouched beside it, ran his hand along the splintered wood, and let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. You kept it up all winter on this. It held barely, barely still holding. He looked up at her from where he crouched, something in his expression she couldn't quite read, and then he reached for the tools without further comment, and they worked in near silence through the afternoon, replacing the makeshift brace with a proper one, cut and fitted and driven home with more than a single desperate spike. From there they moved to the sagging gate, then the creek crossing, worn away by months of runoff into something no longer entirely safe for cattle to ford. Then a broken section of fence along the lower meadow that had given way sometime in the deep cold and simply never gotten fixed. None of it changed the ranch all at once. Each repair simply removed one more problem from the growing pile of tomorrows Cora had been dreading, one at a time, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a thing finally, properly done. While working near the barn one afternoon, Nathaniel found himself studying the northwest side of the property, the direction the worst winter wind always seemed to come from. "This wall takes the brunt of it," he said, more to himself than to her. "Every storm. It does." He walked the open ground beyond it, pacing, measuring something with his eyes that Cora couldn't yet see the shape above. "I could build a break. Out here," he gestured, roughly 25 feet from the barn wall. Cottonwood poles. Willow woven tight between them. Take the worst of the wind before it ever reaches the building. Cora looked toward the ridgeline, where the wind always seemed to gather itself, before pouring down into the basin. "Too tight a weave, and the snow won't care where you put it," she said. "It'll pile up right against whatever you build, and then you've just moved the problem 25 feet closer to the barn, instead of solving it." He rested a hand against one of the fence posts, considering that it's far enough out. Snow won't reach the barn, even if it drifts against the break itself. "We'll see. After the next real snow." He didn't argue further, just nodded. And they built the first section his way. Cottonwood posts sunk deep into ground, still soft from the thaw. Willow branches woven between them, tight enough to slow the wind without stopping it entirely. And Cora found herself, more than once over the following days, standing back to study the structure with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not quite trust, not quite doubt. Something suspended between the two, waiting to see which of the coming seasons would tip it. Days settled into a rhythm neither of them commented on out loud. Cora rode the meadow each morning, checking cattle, while Nathaniel split poles for fence repair or worked the new windbreak section by section. In the afternoons they worked together, mending fence, clearing brush, hauling deadfall. And at dusk, the tools were cleaned and returned to the bench, hammer beside auger, exactly the way her father had always kept them, exactly the way Cora had quietly restored them to sitting once Nathaniel had ridden back through her gate. Some evenings they sat near the stove, the same two chairs angled toward each other now, instead of her father's chair sitting alone and turned toward an empty door. Other, warmer nights, they sat out on the porch instead, watching the last light drain slowly out of the basin. Nathaniel talked, on those evenings, about freight roads he'd traveled, stockyards he'd worked, bad horses he'd broken, and good ones he'd sold for less than they were worth, because the buyer needed the sale more than he needed the extra dollar. Camps that had sprung up around some temporary need and then vanished entirely once the work moved on, leaving nothing behind but flattened grass and cold fire pits. Cora told him, in turn, where Stone Hollow Creek flooded worst in a wet spring, which slopes dried first when the thaw finally came, where the winter wind, tricky and deceptive, left bare ground exposed beneath drifts that looked, from a distance, like they should have been deep everywhere equally. 1 week became 2. Neither of them mentioned the agreement they'd made at the gate. Neither of them brought up the question of when, exactly, the work would be even, or what happened after it was. Each night, Nathaniel rolled his bedroll into the same corner of the cabin, near the wall opposite the stove. His spare clothes stayed packed inside his saddlebag. The bedroll always returned to that same corner, night after night, but he never fully unpacked it. Left it half-tied, half open, The way a man leaves something when part of him is still keeping one foot pointed toward the door. Cora noticed. She noticed most things, out here, where noticing was often the difference between a ranch that survived and one that didn't. She never asked him why. The answer came, unasked, before April was finished, though not in the way either of them might have expected, and not from anything either of them said out loud. It came instead in the form of a late-season snow that crossed the Judith Basin one evening after dark. Not a dangerous storm by any measure Cora had learned to fear. By morning, only a few inches had accumulated across the meadow, hardly worth remarking on after the winter they'd survived together and separately. But it was enough. Nathaniel stepped outside that morning and stopped dead in the doorway. The windbreak had done exactly what he'd expected it to do, breaking the direct force of the wind before it reached the barn. But along the edge of the structure, where his tighter weave had forced the air to curl hard around itself, instead of simply slowing, the snow had followed the curling air and piled into a thick, curved drift that reached nearly to the livestock gate. Cora walked past him, carrying an armful of willow stakes, and said nothing at all. She pushed one stake into the deepest part of the drift, another where the snow had begun to thin, marking the shape of the problem the way she'd learned, years ago, to mark every problem on this land before trying to solve it. Nathaniel walked the full length of the windbreak in silence, studied the bare, wind-scoured ground on the windward side. The heavy deposit gathered behind it, the curved ridge of drift reaching, almost accusingly, toward the gate his design was meant to protect. "You're not trying to stop it," he said finally, half to himself. Cora glanced toward the ridge, toward the wind that never stopped, only redirected itself endlessly across this basin, year after year, storm after storm. "Wind doesn't stop," she said. "You make it spend itself before it gets where it's going. That's the whole trick of it." He looked back at the drift his tighter weave had created. The snow, in its own indifferent way, had settled the argument overnight, far more convincingly than any words either of them might have offered. He went for his tools without another word. Together, that whole morning, they opened gaps through the woven sections he'd built too tight, changed the angle of the outer end, extending it further out from the barn, while keeping the main body of the barrier exactly 25 feet away, the distance Cora had insisted on from the start. He picked up the hammer. For a second, Cora expected him to drive the next post himself, the way he'd driven every post before this one, careful and competent, and largely without needing her input. Instead, he held the hammer out to her. She took it. He stepped back, made room, and watched while she marked where the next post would go and drove it home herself, the iron ringing clear and true against the cool spring air, and something about the small gesture, the offered hammer, the space he'd made for her without being asked, settled into her chest and stayed there in a way she wasn't yet ready to examine too closely. Spring thaw, true to form, exposed another problem entirely. During the worst of February's cold, Cora had piled extra earth over a low section of the wooden water conduit, hoping to keep the flow from freezing solid overnight. It had worked, mostly, but the same ground that had helped in February now stayed wet long after everything around it had dried, runoff collecting beside the trench and soaking steadily into the packed bedding around the wooden box beneath. Within days of the thaw finishing, one edge of the buried channel began to slump. Cora studied it with a shovel in hand, jaw set. "It needs to go deeper." Nathaniel crouched beside the trench, following the grade of the land with his eyes the way he seemed to follow most problems, patient, unhurried, looking for the shape of the thing before deciding how to fix it. "Depth isn't the problem," he said finally, and pushed the shovel into the wet earth. Water welled up almost immediately around the blade. "It's got nowhere to shed, nowhere to drain to. You could dig this 10 feet down and it'd still flood right back in on you." They dug the trench open together to confirm it, and found mud pressing hard against both sides of the conduit, exactly as he'd predicted, trapped, with nowhere to go. Nathaniel proposed something different, a shallow bypass channel cut for the runoff itself, diverting it away before it ever reached the buried box. Coarse gravel laid beneath the low section, to give water somewhere to move through instead of pooling. The wooden box itself raised slightly, just enough to restore an even, steady fall along its length. And at the access point, a removable lid, so the whole channel could be cleared out in future without needing to dig the entire thing open again from scratch. Cora worked alongside him without complaint, though every shovel of earth she removed was, in a very real sense, undoing work she herself had done only weeks before, in the depths of February, with cold hands and no other options available to her. I hated doing that twice, she admitted at one point, straightening, pressing a hand to the small of her back. Nathaniel tamped gravel into place beside the box, not looking up. Better in April than in January. Cora tried to hold her expression steady. Failed. A short laugh escaped her before she could stop it, surprised out of her by the plain, understated truth of what he'd said. Nathaniel looked up at the sound. Something shifted in his face, open in a way she hadn't quite seen before. It was, she realized later, the first time he'd heard her laugh at all, in 5 months of storms and silence and careful, guarded conversation. By afternoon, water was draining cleanly away from the conduit instead of collecting dangerously around it. Cora looked down at the finished section, satisfied despite herself, despite the aching back and mud caked to her knees. Through the weeks that followed, into May and toward June, the separate repairs they'd made across the ranch began, slowly, to work together as something closer to a whole system than a collection of individual fixes. The windbreak grew, section by section, along the northwest side of the barn. Cottonwood posts holding split willow, woven loose enough now to let air pass through without stopping it dead. The structure standing exactly 25 feet clear of the building itself, the distance Cora had insisted on from that first disagreement. Inside the barn, they improved the corner where the sick calf had spent that bitter February night. Reed mats and dried bunchgrass formed a second inner layer against low, creeping drafts, while the space above remained open, allowing damp air to rise and escape rather than settling heavy and dangerous around the animals below. The spring-fed waterline received its own careful attention. Straw and reed insulation, a proper covering of earth, a shallow drainage channel dug beneath its lowest, most vulnerable section. Removable access points at intervals, so that any future blockage could be cleared without tearing the whole system open again. They repaired the corral fence post by post, rebuilt the creek, crossing with flat stones set carefully into the bank to prevent further erosion, reset the meadow fence along its full, disputed length, worked the dun mare steadily, patiently, until she handled cattle without fighting the reins, until she moved through a herd the way a good working horse ought to, calm and purposeful, and unbothered by the noise and press of animals around her. Stone Hollow Creek still looked, by any objective measure, worn, weathered by a hard winter and years of a single family doing its best with limited hands. It no longer looked neglected. That distinction mattered to Cora more than she quite knew how to say out loud, though she suspected. Watching Nathaniel work some quiet mornings with an ease that hadn't been there in November, that he understood it anyway, without needing to be told. One afternoon in early June, Caleb Voss rode in from his own place, 8 miles east across the basin, an older rancher, weathered and blunt, who'd worked cattle in this country long enough to trust only what had already proven itself against a Montana winter and to view anything untested with a healthy dose of skepticism. He reined in beside the windbreak, studied the gaps in the woven willow, the deliberate spaces Cora had insisted on from the very first disagreement. Then he laughed. Short. Not unkind, but not entirely convinced either. You left half the wind in it. Cora leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, unbothered. That's the half we wanted in it. Caleb shook his head, clearly unpersuaded, and rode on toward the creek without further comment. Nathaniel watched him go, then glanced sideways at Cora. Want me to close it up tighter? So people stop talking about it? She looked at the windbreak, at its deliberate, imperfect gaps, at the bare ground beyond it, still clear, still exactly as intended. No, there was nothing more to discuss after that. Caleb had his opinion, formed from years of a different approach on his own land, and he was entitled to it, but the windbreak hadn't yet faced a full Montana winter of its own. When it did, Cora suspected, opinion would carry considerably less weight than results. In the middle of June, before any of it, before Martian Blackwell and the name Thaddeus Renner had entered their lives at all, there was a Sunday that Cora would think back on, often in the difficult months that followed, a day that seemed, in memory, to hold the whole shape of what they'd built together in miniature. She'd suggested, almost on impulse, that they ride the full boundary of the ranch together, not for work, not to check fence or count cattle, but simply to see it, the way you might walk through a house you'd lived in your whole life and still find room to notice something new. Nathaniel had looked at her strangely when she proposed it, as though checking whether she meant it, and then he'd saddled the dun mare without another word. They rode the northern boundary first, along the ridge where the worst winter wind gathered itself before pouring down into the basin. The windbreak below them, a dark, deliberate line, even from this distance, growing steadily more solid with every week of work they put into it. From up there, Cora could see the whole shape of Stone Hollow Creek laid out below, the cabin small and steady beside the barn, the water line a pale seam running down toward the trough, the cattle scattered loose and unhurried across the greening meadow. "Doesn't look like much from down there," Nathaniel said, following her gaze. "From up here you can see how it all fits. My father used to ride up here sometimes," Cora said. "Never told me why. I always assumed it was just to be alone a while. Maybe it was this. Maybe he just wanted to see the whole of it laid out at once. Reminds a man what he's actually working for, seeing it from a distance like this." They rode on, down through the eastern meadow, where the creek ran loudest this time of year, swollen still with the last of the snowmelt, and stopped to let the horses drink at a bend Cora had loved since childhood, where a stand of old cottonwoods leaned out over the water and cast the whole pool in deep green shade. "My mother used to bring me here," she said, surprising herself with the admission. She rarely spoke of her mother, who died when Cora was too young to hold on to more than fragments, the smell of her hair, the particular way she'd hummed while she worked. Before she passed, "I don't remember much. Just this spot, the sound of the water." Nathaniel was quiet a moment, letting the words settle rather than rushing to fill the space around them, which she'd come to understand was simply how he was built. Patient in conversation, the same way he was patient with a stubborn fence post or a green horse. "You never talk about her," he said finally. "Not much left to talk about. Just this place, the water." She looked out at the pool, sunlight scattering gold across the moving surface. "Maybe that's enough, though. Maybe that's what a person leaves behind, if they're lucky. Not stories, just a place that still holds them somehow." "I think that's most of what anybody leaves," Nathaniel said quietly. "The stories fade first. The places hold on longer." They sat a while in the cottonwood shade, saying little, and Cora found herself, watching the water move past, thinking not of grief, but of something closer to gratitude. An odd guess to find sitting beside sorrow, though she supposed the two weren't as opposed to each other as she'd once assumed. By the time they turned back toward the cabin, the afternoon had gone long and golden, the particular light of a June evening in Montana that seemed to stretch time itself, unwilling to let the day end. Nathaniel rode a little behind her on the narrow trail through the lower meadow, and Cora found herself, without quite deciding to, slowing her own pace to match his, rather than pushing on ahead the way she might have done a few months earlier. "Thank you," she said, not turning around, "for riding it with me. I don't know why I wanted company for it today. Just did." "Didn't need a reason," Nathaniel said. "Glad you asked." That evening, they ate supper on the porch instead of inside, the last of the light fading slow over the basin, and Cora found herself doing something she hadn't done in longer than she could easily remember. Simply sitting, not working through the next task in her mind, not measuring hay or counting days until the next debt came due. Just sitting, comfortable, beside a man who had ridden into a blizzard's aftermath as a stranger and had, somewhere in the months since, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, stopped being one. She understood, watching the stars emerge slow over the ridgeline, that whatever came next, whatever trouble might eventually find its way to Stone Hollow Creek, she would not be facing it the way she'd faced the winter before, alone with only her own stubborn will and her father's empty chair for company. She would be facing it beside someone who had chosen, freely, more than once now, to stay. By late June, word had traveled through the wider settlement, the way word always did in a place this small and this isolated, that Nathaniel Cole had stayed on at Hartwell Ranch considerably longer than the few weeks he'd first proposed at the gate. Mara Pike, a prominent figure in the local women's circle at the church, found Cora one afternoon outside the general store in town, her voice pitched low and careful, the the tone of someone delivering an unwelcome truth she considered herself obligated to share. A woman alone can lose a good name faster than she can ever earn it back, Mara warned. A man sleeping under the same roof, unmarried. People notice that, Cordelia. People talk. Cora let her finish without interrupting, then went inside the store without offering a response, because there wasn't one that would satisfy Mara Pike, and she'd long ago stopped wasting energy on conversations that couldn't be won. Inside Orrin Blackwell, the storekeeper who had carried the Hartwell account through more than one lean season in years past, expecting payment only once cattle sold in the fall, pushed the account ledger across the counter toward her, instead of simply updating it as usual. "I'll need this settled sooner than usual this year," he said. No particular insult in his tone, no mention of Nathaniel at all. He didn't have to mention him. The implication sat there between them regardless, unspoken, understood. Cora studied the figures in silence, said nothing about the timing or the reason behind it, and simply began working out in her head how she might manage an earlier payment than expected. That was where the trouble began. Small, almost invisible at first, buried in the ordinary friction of small-town gossip, and a storekeeper suddenly less patient than his own history of patience had ever suggested he'd be. Because Orrin Blackwell had never once, in 3 years of carrying the Hartwell account through hard seasons, asked for early payment before. Something had changed. Cora didn't yet know what, or why, or who exactly stood behind the sudden shift, but some quiet, watchful part of her, the same part that had learned to read weather before it arrived and trouble before it announced itself, noted the change and filed it carefully away. She paid what she could toward the account, took her salt, and left the rest of the ledger unresolved. On the ride home, Nathaniel kept the mare beside hers, neither of them speaking for several long miles, the ranch slowly coming into view ahead of them, the windbreak a dark, deliberate line against the summer grass. "You want me gone," he said finally. Not quite a question. Cora kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Didn't answer right away. That evening, once the cattle had settled and the light had begun its long, slow slide toward dusk, they sat together on the porch, and Cora told him what Mara Pike had said outside the store, told him about Blackwell's ledger, pushed toward her without explanation, and the account he'd never before asked to see settled early. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, something working behind his eyes that Cora couldn't fully read. When she finished, he looked out across the darkening yard for a long moment. "I can leave," he said. "If me being here is costing you something, I'll ride out tomorrow." The words settled into the space between them, heavy, and Cora found herself, for the first time in a long while, uncertain how to answer honestly. All winter, she had kept this ranch alive entirely alone. She knew with complete certainty that she could do it again if she had to. That wasn't the question weighing on her now. Sitting beside him in the fading light, and some part of her recognized clearly, for the first time, that it hadn't been the real question in a while. "No," she said finally. He turned toward her. "No, what?" She kept her eyes on the pasture, on the windbreak standing dark and deliberate against the last of the light, on everything they had built together across these past months that had nothing at all to do with charity or debt, and everything to do with something she hadn't yet found the courage to name. "No, I don't want you gone." Nathaniel didn't reach for her, didn't press for anything beyond what she'd already offered. He simply nodded, quiet, and let the silence between them settle into something that felt, for the first time since Mara Pike's warning outside the store, entirely undisturbed. But somewhere behind them, in the direction of town, a decision had already been set in motion that neither of them yet fully understood. A ledger pushed forward early. A price offered too low and then raised, twice by a cattle buyer, who seemed strangely determined to see the Hartwell herd sold off cheap and fast. And behind both of those small, ordinary pressures, unseen for now, unnamed for now, a man named Thaddeus Renner, whose interest in Stone Hollow Creek ran far deeper and far older than either Cora or Nathaniel yet had any reason to suspect. That night, after the fire had burned low and the cabin had gone quiet, Cora lay awake a long while, listening to the wind move soft and unremarkable through the willow of the windbreak outside, and thought, without quite knowing why, of her father's letter. The one she'd found tucked behind the ledger back in October, folded small, easy to overlook, in a hand she hadn't recognized. An offer to buy Stone Hollow Creek. made not long before her father's death, and refused. In his own careful writing, without explanation. She had read it once, set it aside, told herself it was old business, settled, finished, a door already closed. Lying awake now, listening to Nathaniel's steady breathing from his corner of the cabin, and the wind testing the windbreak, the way it tested everything eventually, Cora found herself wondering, for the first time in months, whether that door had ever truly been closed at all, or whether it had simply been waiting, quietly, for spring. Part 2: The Price of Water. The trouble arrived the way most trouble arrived out here. Quiet at first, wearing an ordinary face. Nothing that announced itself as danger until it had already gotten close enough to matter. It was the second week of July when Dalton Marsh rode up the Basin Road towards Stone Hollow Creek, a cattle buyer Cora had dealt with twice before, both times fair, both times businesslike, both times gone within the hour once the numbers were settled. This time, he didn't leave within the hour. Cora watched him ride in from the porch, hat low against the sun, a wagon trailing behind him, instead of the single horse he usually rode alone. That struck her first. Wrong. A man buying cattle didn't need a wagon unless he was hauling something other than livestock, and Dalton Marsh had never once, in 3 years of dealing with the Hartwell herd, brought anything but himself and his tally book. "Afternoon," he said, reining in at the gate. He didn't dismount. "Afternoon." Cora came down off the porch, wiping her hands on her apron out of habit more than need. "You're early for the fall count." "Ain't here for the fall count." He glanced past her, toward the barn, toward the windbreak visible along the northwest line, toward Nathaniel, who'd come out from behind the barn at the sound of hooves, and now stood watching, saying nothing, his eyes doing the same slow read of the situation that hers were. "Then what are you here for, Dalton?" He named a number. Cora didn't answer right away, because the number he named was low, not a little low. Low enough that it sat in the air between them like something rotten, low enough that she found herself doing the arithmetic twice, just to be certain she'd heard him correctly the first time. "That's half what you paid last fall," she said finally. "Market's different this year." "Market's not that different." He shrugged, the particular shrug of a man delivering a message he hadn't written himself and didn't feel any real responsibility for. "It's what I've got to offer." Cora looked at him a long moment, at the wagon behind him, empty, waiting, at the way his eyes kept sliding sideways toward Nathaniel, and then away again, like there was a second conversation happening underneath the first one. A conversation nobody in this yard was going to say out loud. "No," she said. Dalton's jaw tightened slightly. "Might not get a better offer this season." "Then I won't sell this season." He held her gaze a moment longer. Something behind his eyes that looked for just a second, almost like an apology. Then he touched his hat brim, turned his horse, and rode back out the way he'd come, wagon rattling empty behind him. Nathaniel crossed the yard once the dust had settled. That wasn't a real offer. No, that was a message. Cora watched the road long after Dalton had disappeared down it. I know. She just didn't yet know who'd sent it. 2 days later, she found out the message had a second half. Orrin Blackwell's boy came riding out from town in the early afternoon, breathless, having pushed his horse harder than the errand strictly required, and handed Cora a folded note before she'd even finished crossing the yard to meet him. She opened it, standing at the gate. "Read it once. Read it again, slower, because the first reading hasn't seemed real. Account balance due in full. 30 days. 30 days," she said out loud, mostly to herself, mostly because saying it out loud was the only way to make herself believe the ink on the page. Nathaniel, coming up beside her, took the note when she offered it without a word. "Read it." His expression didn't change much, but something in his shoulders went very still. "He's never asked for full payment before harvest," Cora said. 3 years. Never once. He's not asking because he wants to. Then why? Nathaniel folded the note carefully, handed it back. "Because somebody's leaning on him. Same as somebody leaned on Marsh to lowball you on cattle." He looked toward the road, the same direction Dalton had ridden off in 2 days before. "Somebody wants you short on cash and short on time. Both at once. That's not an accident. That's a plan." Cora felt something cold settle low in her stomach, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with weather. Who? I don't know yet. But something in the way he said it, quiet, careful, his eyes not quite meeting hers, told her that he had at least a guess, and that he wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. She didn't push, not that day. That night, though, Lying awake with the note from Blackwell, folded on the table where she could see it in the dying firelight, Cora found her mind circling back to her father's letter. Folded small, a hand she hadn't recognized, an offer to buy Stone Hollow Creek, refused in her father's careful writing, without explanation. She got up, crossed the cabin quiet enough not to wake Nathaniel in his corner, dug through the small wooden box, where she kept what remained of her father's papers, pushed to the back of the shelf since September, because looking through them too closely had always felt like something she wasn't ready to do. She found the letter near the bottom, unfolded it by the light of a single candle. The signature at the bottom, small, formal, unremarkable at first glance. Thaddeus Renner. She didn't recognize the name. Not directly. But something about it snagged at her memory anyway. The way a name does when you've heard it mentioned in passing, at the store, at church, somewhere in the ordinary noise of small-town conversation you weren't paying close attention to at the time. She sat with the letter a long while, reading the offer itself, formal and cold, an amount that would have covered every debt her father had ever carried twice over, and beneath it, in her father's own hand, a single line added at the bottom before he'd apparently decided not to send any reply at all. Not for sale. Not to him. Not ever. Which meant her father had known this man. Known him well enough to refuse him not just with a price, but with something that read almost like a warning to himself. A note to remember why the answer would always be no, regardless of the number attached to the offer. She folded the letter carefully back along its original creases, sat there in the dark a long while, listening to Nathaniel's steady breathing across the room, and turned the name over and over in her mind. Thaddeus Renner. In the morning, she asked Nathaniel directly. He was at the waterline, checking one of the removable access lids they'd installed back in the spring, and he went very still when she said the name out loud, standing there in the early light with her arms crossed and her father's letter folded in her coat pocket. "Where'd you hear that name?" he said. "Careful. Too careful. My father's papers," he wrote. Renner turned down an offer to buy this ranch before he died. She watched Nathaniel's face while she said it. "You know him." A long silence. Long enough that Cora felt the cold in her stomach return, sharper this time. "I worked for him," Nathaniel said finally. 2 seasons back. Broke horses for his outfit out past Fort Benton. And it didn't end well. That's not an answer, Nathaniel. He set down the tool he'd been holding, turned to face her fully. And something in his expression had shifted into a kind of tired honesty she hadn't seen from him before, not even that first week, half frozen and barely conscious in her father's cabin. "Renner runs the biggest outfit in this basin," he said. "Cattle, mostly. But he's been buying up land quiet, for years, piece by piece, and nobody's ever been quite sure why one man needs that much ground when half of it's rougher grazing than what he's already got." He paused. "I found out why. Toward the end of my second season with him. Found out how. Overheard something I wasn't meant to." Cora waited. "There's water under this basin," Nathaniel said. "Not everywhere. Most of it's shallow ground. Dries up fast in a bad year, same as anywhere else out here. But there's a deep spring system running under a handful of properties, and it doesn't dry up. Not in drought years. Not ever, far as anyone's ever recorded." He glanced toward the spring box, the source that fed their own water line, the one that had slowed but never once fully stopped, not even in the worst weeks of February. "This is one of them." Cora felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her, not literally, but close enough that she reached out and steadied herself against the fence post beside her. "He wants my water. He wants every property sitting over that spring system. This one included. Once he's got them all, he controls the only water in this basin that doesn't fail. Doesn't matter how bad the drought gets after that. Everybody with cattle in this valley either pays him for access, or they sell out and move on." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "That's not a rumor. I heard him say it himself, planning it out loud with 2 of his men, thinking nobody else was listening. And you left." "I left." His voice went lower. "Told him I wanted no part of it. He didn't take that well." Cora studied him a long moment, something clicking into place that she hadn't let herself fully consider before now. "That's why you were riding alone through a blizzard last November. Nowhere near any road that made sense for a man delivering horses." Nathaniel didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet, steady, like a confession he'd been carrying a long time and was finally setting down. He doesn't forgive a man walking away from him, especially not one who knows what he knows. A pause. I've been careful ever since. Careful where I go, who I talk to, how long I stay in any one place. Another pause. Longer this time. I stayed here longer than I meant to. Cora heard what wasn't said underneath that sentence. Heard it clearly enough that something in her chest tightened, half fear, half something else entirely, something she still hadn't found a name for. Is that why Marsh lowballed me? Why Blackwell wants the account settled early? I don't know for certain. Nathaniel's eyes were steady on hers now, but I'd bet everything I've got left that it traces back to Renner, one way or another. He's got money enough to lean on half this basin without ever showing his own face doing it. Cora looked past him, toward the spring box, toward the water line they'd spent months rebuilding together, all of it suddenly meaning something entirely different than it had an hour ago. Not just a repair, a prize somebody else wanted badly enough to squeeze her from every direction at once, until she had no choice left but to sell. I'm not selling, she said. Quiet. Certain. I know that. Nathaniel's voice carried something rough in it. But he's not going to stop just because you say no once. Men like Renner don't hear no. They hear a price they haven't offered yet. Then he'll keep offering, she said. And I'll keep saying no, however many times that takes. Nathaniel looked at her a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. He's not going to stop at offers forever, he said quietly. Eventually, a man like that gets tired of asking. Neither of them said what came after. They thought out loud. But it sat between them anyway, unspoken heavy. And Cora found herself, for the first time since her father's death, genuinely afraid of what the coming months might bring. She paid Blackwell's account in full within the 30 days, though it meant selling off 2 horses she couldn't afford to lose and going without new boots for another season. She watched him count the money without a word of apology, without any acknowledgement at all that the deadline had ever been unusual. Marsh didn't come back with a better offer. She hadn't expected him to. But the pressure didn't stop. It simply changed shape. A week after she settled the account, one of her fence lines along the eastern boundary turned up cut. Not fallen. Not weathered loose the way fence sometimes did after a hard winter. Cut clean, with something sharp in 3 places along a stretch that ran close to the county road, and 11 head of cattle wandered through the gap before Cora found it at dawn and spent the better part of a day rounding them back in. Coyotes don't cut fence with a blade, Nathaniel said, crouching beside one of the severed posts, running his thumb along the clean edge of the cut wire. No, Cora agreed. They don't. They rebuilt the fence that same day, said little about it, beyond the practical business of the repair itself. But Cora noticed, that night and every night after, that Nathaniel began sleeping closer to the door instead of his usual corner, and that he'd taken to carrying her father's old rifle with him now, whenever he rode the fence line alone. She didn't ask him to. She didn't tell him to stop either. Late in July, Mara Pike found her again outside the general store, though this time her voice carried less warning and more something that sounded, uncomfortably, like satisfaction. Word is Thaddeus Renner's been asking after your ranch, Mara said, keeping her voice low. Asking around town, whether you'd consider an offer. I wouldn't. That's not what I heard. Mara's eyes were sharp, watching Cora's face closely. Heard he's prepared to be generous. More generous than most would expect, given the state of things out at your place. The state of things is fine. Is it? Mara's tone shifted, softer now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Cordelia, a woman alone, carrying debt, carrying a man under her roof who isn't her husband, and word is that man used to work for Renner himself before something went sour between them. People are starting to wonder exactly what kind of trouble you've invited onto that land. Cora felt her jaw tighten. People should mind their own land and leave mine be. People will, Mara said, the moment there's nothing left out Stone Hollow worth talking about. Until then, I'd think carefully about who you're trusting, and why. She walked on before Cora could answer, leaving her standing there on the boardwalk with her basket half filled and her chest tight with a fury she didn't quite have anywhere to put. She didn't tell Nathaniel what Mara had said. Not that day. Some part of her, she realized on the ride home, was afraid of what saying it out loud might do. August brought the heat, dry and relentless, the kind that turned the meadow grass brittle and made every trip to check the water line feel more urgent than the last. Stonehouse Creek itself ran lower than Cora had ever seen it. though the spring-fed section, the deep source Nathaniel had explained to her, held steady, cold, clear, exactly as it always had. It was the one thing on the ranch that didn't seem touched by the drought settling over the rest of the basin. Late one evening, walking the fence line together after supper, Nathaniel stopped near the northeast corner, looking out toward Caleb Voss's land in the distance, where even from here they could see the pale, cracked earth where his lower pasture had been. His stock's hurting, Nathaniel said quietly. Worse than ours. His spring's not deep. Dries up most summers, just not usually this bad. If this drought holds through September, he'll be in real trouble. Cora looked at him. Something forming in her mind, slow at first, then with more certainty the longer she turned it over. If Renner wants every property over that deep spring system, she said carefully, and Caleb's isn't one of them, then Caleb's not really the target here. No, he's just going to suffer alongside whoever is. Unless somebody helps him. Nathaniel turned to look at her fully. Cora, I mean it. If I let him run some cattle down to our trough, share what we've got until the rains come back, that's not charity. That's just what neighbors do out here. Always has been. That's also exactly the kind of thing that gets noticed. Let it get noticed. Something hard had settled into her voice, resolve she hadn't fully felt until the words were already out of her mouth. If Renner wants to squeeze this basin dry one ranch at a time, maybe the answer isn't every one of us, standing alone waiting our turn. Nathaniel studied her a long moment in the fading light. Something that looked almost like pride moving behind his eyes, mixed with something more worried underneath it. You start pulling this basin together against him, he said slowly, and you make yourself the center of it. That paints a bigger target on this ranch, not a smaller one. Maybe. Cora held his gaze steady. Or maybe a target's harder to hit when it's not standing alone. She rode to Caleb Voss's place the following morning. Caleb met her at his own gate, hat pushed back, sweat already darkening his shirt despite the early hour, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man watching a season slip away from him, one dry day at a time. Cordelia. A nod. Wary but not unfriendly. Something wrong out at your place? No. Came about yours. She dismounted, looked past him toward the cracked lower pasture, the cattle standing listless in whatever shade they could find. Your spring's failing. Same as half the basin this year. He said it plainly, without much bitterness, the way a man says something he's already made peace with. Nothing to be done about a dry summer except wait it out. Our spring's holding steady. Deep source. Hasn't dropped an inch all season. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Careful now. Studying her. Heard that about your place, actually. Wondered if it was true. It's true. Cora held his gaze. I'd let you run cattle down to our trough. Share what we've got till the rains come. Caleb was quiet a long moment, weighing pride against practicality, weighing whatever he'd heard about her, and Nathaniel and the trouble apparently gathering around Stone Hollow Creek against the plain, undeniable fact that his herd was dying of thirst. Why, he said finally, you don't owe me anything. Never have. Because that's what neighbors do out here. Always has been. She paused. And because I think somebody's trying to make sure none of us remember that anymore. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. You talking about Renner. The name landed between them, plain out in the open air for the first time outside her own cabin walls. You know him. Everybody in this basin knows him. Questions whether everybody knows what he's after. Caleb studied her a long moment. You do, don't you? Know exactly what he's after. Cora didn't answer right away, but something in her silence must have confirmed it clearly enough, because Caleb's jaw tightened and he looked out toward his own failing pasture with an expression that had shifted from tired resignation into something sharper. He came around here too, Caleb admitted quietly. Month back. Offered to buy the lower section outright. Said the drought was only going to get worse, and I'd be smart to sell before my herd started dying on me anyway. A humorless laugh. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured he was just a man with more money than sense, looking to expand while land was cheap. It's not about expanding, Cora said. It's about water. There's a spring system running under a handful of properties in this basin. Doesn't fail, not even in a bad drought. Mine's one of them. If he controls all the properties sitting over it, he controls the only reliable water for miles, and every rancher left standing either pays him for access or sells out. Caleb was quiet a long while, his eyes moving slowly across his own dying pasture as though seeing it, in the coming years, in an entirely new light. "That's not a man building a ranch," he said finally, low. "That's a man building a stranglehold." "Yes, and you're telling me this why? Instead of just letting the rest of us find out the hard way, one dry season at a time, same as Cy nearly did." Cora met his eyes steadily. "Because a stranglehold only works if nobody sees the hand doing the squeezing until it's too late to do anything about it. I'd rather we all saw it now, while there's still time to do something." Caleb studied her a long moment, something working behind his weathered face, and then he extended his hand. "Run my cattle down to your trough," he said. "I'll owe you for it. Properly. Not charity." "Not charity," Cora agreed, and shook his hand. Word traveled through the basin faster than Cora expected. By the second week of August, 3 more small outfits, ranchers she barely knew beyond a nod at church or a wave passing on the road, had sent word asking whether the offer extended to them as well. Cora said yes to every one of them. It meant longer days, more cattle to manage at the trough, careful rotation to keep the spring from being overtaxed, more hands needed for work that had, until recently, been managed by just herself and Nathaniel. But it also meant something else, something that took her a while to fully recognize for what it was. It meant Stone Hollow Creek was no longer standing alone against whatever Renner intended. By the middle of August, the arrangement had grown into something Cora hadn't quite planned for, though, looking back, she supposed some part of her had hoped for exactly this, without daring to say so out loud. Caleb Voss started riding over most mornings before his own chores, not because Cora needed the extra hand at the trough, but because 2 sets of eyes on the road caught more than one did, and both of them understood that, without either having to explain it. He brought his nephew sometimes, a lean, quiet boy of maybe 16 named Robert, who worked hard and asked no questions and seemed to have been told, in no uncertain terms, to keep his mouth shut about whatever he saw out at Stone Hollow Creek. The Delaney's came next, a young couple 2 properties over whose well had gone bitter with alkali the summer before and had never fully recovered. Then the Hoyt place, run by a widow named Constance Hoyt, who arrived the first day with her chin up and her jaw set, clearly expecting to be turned away, and left 3 hours later, having agreed to a rotation schedule with a kind of stunned gratitude she didn't quite know how to voice. "Word spreading faster than the water is," Nathaniel observed one evening, watching 6 different brands of cattle mingling peaceably enough at the long trough while their owners stood in loose clusters nearby, trading news and complaints about the heat. "Good," Cora said. "Let it spread. You understand what you're building here isn't just neighbors sharing water anymore." She did understand it, though she hadn't quite found words for it until he said it plain. What had started as a single favor to Caleb had become, over the course of 6 weeks, something closer to a standing alliance, informal, unspoken, but real enough that half the small outfits in the basin now looked to Stone Hollow Creek the way a herd looks to whichever animal has decided, without being asked, to walk point. That kind of position came with weight. She felt it most nights now, a low, steady hum of responsibility. Underneath everything else, the knowledge that if this arrangement failed, if the spring ever did run dry, or if Renner found some way to poison the well of trust she'd spent weeks building, it wouldn't just be her own herd that suffered for it. The test of that responsibility came on a Tuesday, in late August, 3 days before the rider arrived with Renner's message. Cora had ridden out early to check the far fence line, the same stretch that had turned up cut back in July, and found 2 men on Hartwell land who had no business being there. Not Marsh, not anyone she recognized from town. Strangers, mounted on good horses, sitting easy in their saddles near the northeast corner where the property line ran closest to the county road, watching the cattle with an attention that had nothing to do with admiration. She reined in a good 50 yards off, close enough to be seen, far enough to have room to run if it came to that. "This is Hartwell land," she called out. "You're on it without invitation." One of the men touched his hat, unhurried, the particular unhurried courtesy of someone who wanted her to know he wasn't afraid of the correction. "Didn't realize we'd crossed a line, ma'am." "Apologies. You're a good half-mile past any line a man could cross by accident." The second man said nothing at all, just watched her, with an expression she didn't care for. Flat and assessing, the kind of look a buyer gives livestock he hasn't decided yet whether he wants. "We'll be moving along," the first man said, and they did, unhurried. taking their time about it in a way that felt less like courtesy and more like a demonstration, a slow, deliberate reminder that they could sit on her land as long as they pleased and leave only when they chose to. Cora didn't mention it to Nathaniel that evening. Told herself there wasn't anything concrete to report. Two strangers on a public adjacent stretch of fence line. Nothing that amounted to a crime or even a clear threat. But she found herself, over the following days, riding that fence line more often than the work strictly required, and she noticed Nathaniel doing the same, though neither of them said why out loud. It was Constance Hoyt, of all people, who put the pieces together first. She arrived at the trough on Thursday morning, looking pale beneath her usual composure, and pulled Cora aside before the others had finished settling their stock. "Two men came by my place yesterday," Constance said, keeping her voice low, asking questions. Not about my cattle, about Stone Hollow Creek. Whether I'd been running stock down here regular, whether I trusted the arrangement, or whether I'd heard anything that might make me think twice about it. "What did you tell them?" Told them it was none of their business, and they didn't much care for that answer. Constance's jaw tightened. One of them said, real casual-like, that arrangements like this one had a way of falling apart. Once winter made things hard enough. Said I'd be smart to have a backup plan in mind. Didn't say whose plan, exactly, but I've got ears. Cordelia. I know whose name sits behind a comment like that. Cora felt the same cold settle in her stomach that had become almost familiar to her now. The particular chill of watching a threat take a new shape before she'd fully finished recognizing the last one. "He's not just squeezing me anymore," she said slowly. "He's working the edges of the whole arrangement, trying to peel people off one at a time before winter, same as he tried to peel me off alone before Nathaniel came back." "Will it work?" Constance asked. Not unkindly, but directly. The question of a woman who'd already decided her own answer and simply wanted to know where everyone else stood. "Not on me." "No," Constance said. "I didn't figure it would. But you should know he's asking. All of us should know it. Better we hear it from each other than have it whispered separate into 6 different ears until half the basin's convinced the other half is about to bolt." That evening, Cora called what amounted to the first real gathering the water-sharing arrangement had ever had. Word passed rancher to rancher through the afternoon, and by dusk nearly every outfit that had joined the rotation stood gathered in her yard. The low autumn light slanting gold across faces that ranged from Caleb's weathered calm to young Robert Voss's wide-eyed attention to Constance Hoyt's careful, watchful pride. Cora stood on the porch steps and told them plainly what she knew. About Renner. About the spring system running beneath a handful of their properties. About the sabotage back in July, the fence cutting, the pressure on her accounts in town, and now the strangers asking questions along the edges of the arrangement itself. "I won't pretend there's no risk in standing together like this," she said, her voice carrying clear across the quiet yard. "A man with that much money can make trouble for anyone who stands against him. But I'd rather face that trouble with all of you beside me than face it alone the way I nearly did last winter. And I think, if you're honest, most of you would say the same." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Caleb stepped forward, spat once into the dust, and extended his hand toward her the way he had back in August at his own gate. "Ain't going anywhere," he said simply. One by one, the others followed. Some with words, some with nothing more than a nod or a hand offered and taken. And by the time full dark had settled over the basin, Cora understood that whatever Renner had hoped to accomplish by working the edges of her arrangement, he had instead handed her something he hadn't intended to give at all. A basin that knew now, with total clarity, exactly what it was standing against, and exactly why it mattered to stand together. The trouble arrived on a hot, still evening in late August, in the form of a rider none of them recognized, sitting a good horse at an easy walk up the basin road, dust rising pale behind him in the last light. He stopped at the gate, didn't dismount Miss Hartwell. A tip of his hat, polite, careful. "Mr. Renner sends his regards." Cora felt Nathaniel go very still beside her. "Then Mr. Renner can send them in person," she said, "or not send them at all." The rider's mouth twitched, something that might have been amusement under different circumstances. "He asked me to relay that he's aware of the arrangement you've made with several of your neighbors. Sharing water. Says it's admirable, neighborly." A pause. Says it also won't hold once the drought worsens, which he expects it will. Says when that happens, his offer for this property will still stand. Generous as ever. Tell him my answer's the same as it's always been. I'll tell him. The writer's eyes moved briefly toward Nathaniel. He also asked me to mention that he remembers Mr. Cole here. Fondly, he said. Asked me to say he hopes old business between them doesn't need revisiting. The threat sat there in the evening air, wrapped in polite phrasing, unmistakable regardless. You can tell him, Nathaniel said, voice low and level. That old business is exactly where he left it. Nothing's changed on my end. The rider held his gaze a moment longer, then touched his hat brim again, turned his horse, and rode back out the way he'd come, unhurried, in no rush at all. Cora watched the road long after he'd disappeared, her heart beating hard and fast against her ribs. He knows you're here, she said quietly. Knows exactly where to find you. He's known for a while, I'd guess. Nathaniel's voice was tight. That's not new information for him. What's new is him saying it out loud. Why now? Because the water sharing worked. Nathaniel turned to look at her fully. You gave this basin a reason to stand together instead of falling one at a time. That's the one thing he can't afford. A united basin doesn't sell out cheap and scared. It holds. And he knows exactly who organized that. Cora felt the weight of that settle over her. Heavy, real. Miu. In the morning, she found Nathaniel already awake, sitting on the porch steps in the pale early light, the rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the road. You're leaving? She said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice carried something rough and tired in it. I've been thinking about it, he admitted. If I ride out, go somewhere far enough that Renner's got no reason left to trouble this place, maybe that's the end of it. Maybe he leaves you be, once the thing he's actually angry about is gone. Cora sat down beside him on the step. You think this is only about you. I think I'm the excuse he's using, on top of whatever else he wants. He wants my water, Nathaniel. He wanted it before you ever rode through that gate, and he'll want it just the same the day after you ride back out of it. Her voice was steady, certain. You leaving doesn't save this ranch. It just means I face him alone. Except now I'll be facing him without the one person who actually understands how he thinks. Nathaniel was quiet a long moment. I offered to leave once before, he said finally. Back in June. You told me no then, too. I remember. Nothing's changed since then. Except the stakes are higher now. He turned to look at her fully, something raw and unguarded in his face. I need you to understand what you're choosing, Cora. If I stay, this doesn't end quiet. A man like Renner doesn't back down just because a handful of ranchers started sharing a trough. He escalates. And I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I know it won't be gentle. Cora held his gaze steady, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Then we face whatever it looks like, she said. Together. That's my answer. Same as it was in June. Something moved across his face. Gratitude and fear, and something else, entirely tangled together. All right, he said finally, quiet. Together then. He set the rifle aside, reached over, slow, careful, and took her hand. She let him. September brought the first hints of relief from the drought, though not enough to undo the damage already done across the basin. A handful of scattered storms filled the smaller springs, enough to ease the worst of the crisis for outfits like Caleb Voss's, though the deep water beneath Stone Hollow Creek had never once wavered regardless. Cora kept the arrangement going anyway, kept the trough open to every neighbor who needed it, and watched something quietly remarkable take shape across the basin as the weeks passed. Ranchers who'd barely spoken beyond a nod at church began riding out together to check shared fence lines. Wives began trading preserves and news at the trough instead of only at Sunday service. Pike stopped warning her about ruined reputations. Started instead bringing baskets of bread out to Stone Hollow Creek on her husband's wagon, staying to talk a while on the porch before heading home. Orrin Blackwell extended credit again without being asked, the earlier deadline seemingly forgotten. Something had shifted. Cora felt it clearly, watching the basin knit itself together in small, quiet ways, week after week, and she understood, without needing anyone to explain it to her, that this was exactly the outcome Thaddeus Renner had least wanted to see, which meant she knew that his response was still coming, simply taking longer to arrive than she might have expected. It arrived in late September, and it arrived at the waterline itself. Cora found it at dawn, walking out to check the trough before the morning chores, and stopped dead at the site waiting for her. One of the removable access points along the buried conduit had been torn open, not lifted carefully the way the design intended. Torn. Splintered wood scattered across the wet ground. The wooden box itself cracked along one side, water seeping out into the surrounding earth, instead of running clean toward the trough where it belonged. Nathaniel. He was at her side within seconds, taking in the damage with the same stunned stillness she'd felt a moment before. He crouched beside the torn access point, ran his fingers along the splintered edge, studying it the way he studied most problems, patient even now, even with fury visibly building behind his controlled expression. This wasn't an accident, he said quietly. Wasn't frost heave. Wasn't ground settling. He pointed to marks in the packed earth beside the box. Somebody dug this out, on purpose. Used something with an edge to crack the box itself once they'd exposed it. When? Sometime in the night, ground still damp where they worked. He straightened, looking toward the tree line beyond the fence. They knew exactly where to hit it. Knew this was the weak point in the whole system. They worked through the day and into the evening, repairing what they could of the damage, though the wooden box itself needed replacing rather than patching. And it took Nathaniel riding into town for fresh lumber and returning grim-faced and mostly silent about whatever conversation he'd had while he was there. What happened, Cora asked, once the light had begun fading toward dusk. Blackwell wouldn't meet my eyes, selling me the lumber. Nathaniel's voice was flat, and there was a man loitering outside the store the whole time I was in there. Watching. Didn't say a word to me. Didn't need to. One of Renner's. I'd bet on it. That night, Cora sat on the porch steps with Nathaniel beside her. Both of them too wound up for sleep. I want to go to the sheriff, Cora said finally, and tell him what? That somebody, unnamed, dug up a water line in the night and cracked it open. No witnesses. No proof of who did it or why. Nathaniel shook his head slowly. Renner's got money enough in this territory that half the law answers to him one way or another. A complaint with no proof just tells him you're rattled. Gives him exactly what he wants. Then what do? We don't let him see us rattled, he said. We rebuild stronger than before. We keep the water sharing going, keep this basin standing together, because that's the one thing he genuinely can't outmoney. And we watch. Careful, because a man who sends someone to sabotage a water line in the dark isn't finished. He's testing how far he can push before somebody pushes back. And if he pushes further, then we push back, he said. Together. Same as we agreed. Over the following weeks, they rebuilt the water line stronger than before, reinforcing the access points with iron fittings instead of simple wooden lids, burying the conduit deeper along its most vulnerable stretch. Cora began keeping her father's rifle within reach, at all times propped inside the cabin door, rather than stored in the barn. Cora shared the sabotage only with Caleb Voss, who took the news with a grim, quiet fury of his own. He's not going to stop, Caleb said. Standing at her gate one afternoon in early October, studying the reinforced water line with a critical eye. Not while there's a chance of squeezing you out before winter. Forces his hand another way. I know. You need more than just yourself and Cole standing watch out here. I'm suggesting this basin's been standing together over water, Caleb said. Maybe it's time it started standing together over more than that. Word passed quietly, over the following key 2 weeks. Among the small circle of outfits Cora had already brought together through the shared trough. Not a formal arrangement. Nothing written down. Just an understanding, passed rancher to rancher, that Stone Hollow Creek would not be left to stand entirely alone against whatever came next. In the last week of October, with the first hard frost settling over the basin, Renner made his final approach before the season closed the road behind him. He came himself this time. Cora watched him ride up the basin road on a gray morning, a single companion beside him, both men well-dressed, well-mounted. Nathaniel came out from the barn at the sound of hooves, and Cora saw something pass across his face at the sight of the second rider. Recognition, old and sharp. That's one of his, Nathaniel said quietly. Used to ride for him back when I did. Renner reined in at the gate, didn't dismount, though he removed his hat in a gesture of formal courtesy that felt, to Cora, entirely hollow. Miss Hartwell. His voice was smooth, cultured, carrying none of the roughness of the basin around them. I believe it's past time we spoke directly. I believe we've nothing to discuss. His eyes moved past her, settling briefly on Nathaniel. Cole. It's been a while. Not long enough, Nathaniel said flatly. Renner's mouth curved, thin, humorless. Still holding a grudge, I see. Wasn't temper, Nathaniel said. Was a decision. I didn't want a part of what you were building. Cora stepped forward, drawing his attention back to her directly. Say what you came to say, Mr. Renner. The road closes soon. I'd rather you be well clear of it, before the first real snow. Very well. Directly, then. He studied her a long moment. This basin has become considerably more troublesome than I anticipated, Miss Hartwell. Your little water-sharing arrangement has proven remarkably resilient. He paused. Which is precisely why I'm prepared to make a final offer. More generous than any I've extended thus far. Enough to settle every debt this ranch has ever carried, with considerable sum left over besides. I'm not selling. You haven't heard the figure yet. I don't need to. The answer's the same, regardless of the number attached to it. Renner's expression cooled further, the false warmth draining entirely from his face. Your father made the same mistake, he said quietly. Refused a fair offer out of stubborn sentiment, and look what it cost him in the end. The words landed like a physical blow. Cora felt her whole body go rigid. What exactly are you implying? Nothing at all. Renner's voice was smooth again, controlled. Only that stubbornness carries a cost, Miss Hartwell. Your father discovered that. I'd hate to see you discover it as well, particularly with winter approaching and your resources, I'm told, considerably strained by recent complications. You mean the water line you had torn open in the dark? Silence stretched between them, brief but absolute. I have no knowledge of any such incident, he said finally, smooth, unbothered, and the very smoothness of the denial told Cora everything the words themselves refused to. Get off my land, she said quiet, steady, and don't come back with another offer. There isn't a number that changes my answer. As you wish. He replaced his hat, turned his horse, paused, looked back once more, his eyes moving to Nathaniel, with something that might have been a final warning. Winter's coming, Miss Hartwell. It has a way of clarifying priorities that summer conversation cannot. He glanced toward the waterline, toward the windbreak. We'll speak again, once the snow has done its work. He rode out with his companion beside him, unhurried, entirely unbothered, and Cora stood at the gate. Long after they disappeared down the basin road, her hands shaking slightly, Nathaniel came to stand beside her. He's not finished, she said quietly. No. Nathaniel's voice was grim. He's just waiting for Winter to do what pressure alone couldn't. Then we make sure Winter proves him wrong, she said. Nathaniel looked at her, something fierce and protective moving across his face, and reached for her hand. The first hard snow arrived in early November, nearly a full year to the day since a screaming horse had first carried a half-frozen stranger to this same gate. It wasn't the storm yet. This was smaller. A warning storm, the kind that tested defenses before the real trial arrived. The windbreak held. The reinforced water line ran clean beneath its layer of fresh snow. Cora stood in the doorway that evening, watching snow settle soft and quiet over ground that had, over the past year, become something far more complicated than simple ranch land. He's out there somewhere, Cora said quietly. Waiting. He is. Nathaniel's hand found hers. Whatever comes, we face it together. That hasn't changed. Part 3, what the storm proved. The storm that mattered came 11 days later. Cora felt it before she saw it. The way she always had. The way her father had taught her, without ever quite explaining how he knew. She stood at the west window that morning, coffee going cold in her hands, watching the horizon go the color of a bruise. It's coming, she said. Nathaniel didn't ask which storm she meant. He'd been waiting for this one same as she had, ever since Renner rode out of the yard at the end of October, with that soft, patient threat trailing behind him like smoke. We'll speak again, once the snow has done its work. Windbreak's tight, Nathaniel said, already pulling his coat on. Checked the lashings yesterday. Water lines reinforced. Iron fittings held through the last freeze. Calvays are moved to the inner corner. Rope between the cabin and barn. They worked through the morning like two people racing a clock they couldn't see. Nathaniel tightened the willow lashings along the windbreak. Cora cleared both access points along the water conduit, packing fresh straw around the iron fittings, checking the removable lids twice. She moved the two weakest calves behind the reed barrier in the barn's inner corner. By early afternoon, the light had gone strange. Flat and gray and wrong. The particular light that came before a Montana blizzard. They strung the rope between cabin and barn just before the first real gusts hit. Nathaniel knotted his end around the porch post. Cora knotted hers around the barn doorframe. Then the blizzard struck. Wind hammered the basin like something with intent behind it. Snow raced sideways across the yard, and the temperature dropped further. Fast, the kind of fast that turned exposed skin numb inside minutes. A section of willow snapped somewhere along the windbreak. Nathaniel turned toward the sound immediately, already reaching for his coat. "I'll replace it. Leave it." Cora caught his arm. "The rest is holding. Water can't wait." "That section can." He hesitated half a second, then nodded. They followed the rope to the conduit together. One access lid had frozen shut despite the fresh straw packed around it that morning. Nathaniel drove the edge of a hatchet beneath the rim, working it back and forth while Cora cleared packed snow from the outlet with her bare hands. The lid broke free with a sound like something exhaling. Water still moved beneath it, thin, slow, but moving. "It's holding," Cora shouted over the wind. For now. They made their way back to the barn as another gust hit hard enough to stagger them both, and inside, the wall groaned under the pressure. Cora pulled the barn door open a crack, just enough to look out, and saw what a year of careful, argued over, painstakingly rebuilt work had actually bought them. Snow had piled deep against the windward side of the willow barrier, exactly as it had that first testing storm back in April. But beyond it, in the space Cora had insisted on, 25 feet of open ground between windbreak and barn, the drift spread out, instead of piling against the building itself. The livestock approach remained passable. The barn door could still open. One panel of willow had broken loose. One access lid had frozen before they'd forced it clear. Nothing had worked perfectly. It didn't need to. What Caleb Voss had once laughed at, called half a wall, was doing exactly what Cora had intended it to do from the very first disagreement. The wind hadn't been stopped. It had spent itself somewhere else. The storm continued into full night, howling and relentless, and Cora and Nathaniel sat close to the stove inside the cabin, both too wound tight to properly rest, listening to the walls take the weight of it and hold. Then something struck the outer gate. She was on her feet before she'd fully decided to move. "Cora, something's at the gate." Nathaniel grabbed the lantern, followed her out into weather that had, if anything, worsened in the hours since dark. They followed the rope, hand over hand, faces stinging, until the gate emerged out of the white ahead. A horse stood there, head low, sides heaving, and leading it, barely upright, snow crusted thick along his shoulders, was Caleb Voss. "Caleb." Cora's voice cracked with the cold, with the shock of it. "What in God's name?" "Naomi." He got the word out between chattering teeth. "She's on the horse. Barn wall came down on our place. Half our stock's loose in this, and I couldn't—" He stopped, swayed. Nathaniel caught his arm before he went down entirely. "Couldn't get her anywhere safer. This was closest." Cora was already moving toward the horse, toward the shape she could now make out slumped in the saddle beneath a coat gone stiff with ice. Naomi Voss, barely conscious, her face gray in the lantern light. They got Naomi down. Between the two of them, they half carried, half dragged her toward the cabin, the rope guiding them true through white that had erased every other landmark in the world. Inside, firelight and warmth hit them like something physical. Cora stripped Naomi's frozen coat away, wrapped her in dry wool, and Nathaniel got broth heating on the stove while Caleb sagged into a chair near the fire. "Small sips," Cora murmured, spooning warm broth past Naomi's cracked lips. "That's it. Small sips." Naomi's eyes fluttered, focused slow on Cora's face above her. "Cordelia." Her voice was a thread. "I'm sorry, we shouldn't have." "Don't you dare apologize." Cora's voice came out fierce. "This is exactly what neighbors do." Caleb, in the chair by the fire, let out a rough breath that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. "Should have listened to you back in April. About that wall." "Not the time, Caleb." "No." His hands were steadying now. "Guess it's not." Near dawn, the wind finally began to ease. By full morning, the storm had weakened to scattered flurries, and Caleb pulled his coat back on and walked outside with Nathaniel and Cora both. He stood at the edge of the yard, looking at what the storm had done and what it hadn't. Beyond the Hartwell windbreak, snow had piled in the same heavy curved drift it always did along the outer edge. But the livestock approach itself remained clear. The barn door stood open, unobstructed. At the conduit, Nathaniel lifted the reinforced access lid. Water still trickled through the wooden channel beneath, thin from the cold but unbroken. Caleb said nothing for a long moment. Just walked, slow and deliberate, toward the windbreak itself, reached out, put one weathered hand flat against the split willow, and looked through the deliberate gaps he had laughed at. Back in June, he turned, began counting his own steps back toward the barn. When he reached the wall, he stopped, turned back toward Cora. 25 feet. Exactly that, Cora said quietly. Caleb walked back to the barrier, ran his fingers once more along one of the gaps he'd mocked, and no apology followed the gesture. None was needed. My own wall, he said finally, low, the solid one. Plank, no gaps at all. Stop the wind clean. He shook his head slowly. Stop the snow too. Right up against the barn. Buried half my approach. Cut my cattle off from water near enough to matter. He looked at Cora. You built something smarter than I did, and I laughed at you for it. You weren't wrong to question it, Cora said. It hadn't proven itself yet. Now it has. I owe you, he said. More than I can pay back easy. You don't owe me anything, Caleb. This is what we agreed to back in August. Neighbors. Standing together. No, his voice was firm. This is more than sharing a trough now. You had my wife under your roof last night. Warm. Alive. Because you built something I didn't have sense enough to build myself. He looked toward his own place, invisible beyond the ridge. I need to get back. Check what's left of my herd. My barn wall. Take what you need from here first, Cora said. Within the hour, Caleb and Naomi, wrapped warm and steady, mounted up for the ride back to their own place. We survived it, Cora said quietly, watching them go. We did. Nathaniel's arm found its way around her shoulders. But he's not going to let this go, Cora. Renner, he said as much himself. Winter would clarify priorities. Winter clarified something, Cora said. Just not what he was hoping for. Word reached them 2 days later that Caleb's losses had been severe but survivable. Nothing that couldn't be rebuilt. And rebuild it he did, over the following 2 weeks, with more help than he'd expected. Ranchers who'd barely known each other beyond a nod at church began showing up at Caleb's place with tools and lumber and spare hands, rebuilding his fallen wall not with solid planks this time, but woven, gapped, deliberate, the way Cora had built hers. It was during one of these visits that word came of something else entirely. Something that would, over the following days, unravel the whole careful, patient game Thaddeus Renner had been playing against them since July. A rider arrived at Caleb's gate mid-afternoon, dusty and travel-worn, asking specifically for Nathaniel Cole. You're him, the rider said. Cole. Worked for Renner's outfit, 2 seasons back. I did. Name's Josiah Merritt. I worked for him too. Left about the same time you did, near as I can figure, though I never knew your name till recently. Only knew there'd been another man before me, who'd walked away from the same operation for the same reasons. What reasons? Cora asked carefully. Josiah's eyes moved to her, then back to Nathaniel. You know what he's been running out past Fort Benton? The horse trading that isn't quite what it looks like on the surface. Nathaniel went very still. I walked before I saw the whole shape of it. I saw the whole shape of it, Josiah said quietly. Stayed longer than I should have. Told myself I was just breaking horses, not asking too many questions about where certain animals came from before they showed up in Renner's stock, or where the money went once they were sold on again. He shook his head slowly. Couldn't stomach it in the end either. Left 3 months back. Been keeping my head down since. Why come find me now? Nathaniel asked. Josiah's expression hardened. Because I heard what he's been doing to this basin. Squeezing ranchers over water rights. Same underhanded methods he used to squeeze horse traders who wouldn't play along with his stolen stock operation. And I got tired of staying quiet about a man who doesn't stop hurting people just because I'm not looking at it anymore. He glanced toward Caleb's rebuilt wall. I'm prepared to give testimony. Sworn before whatever authority will actually listen. Cora felt something like hope catch fire in her chest. There's a federal marshal out of Fort Benton, she said slowly. Answers to Washington, not to whoever's paying off the local sheriff. If stolen stock crossed territory lines during any of these trades, that's federal jurisdiction, beyond Renner's reach to simply buy his way out of. Then that's where we go, Nathaniel said. Together. There's more, Josiah added quietly. He reached into his coat, produced a small, worn ledger. Kept my own tally toward the end. Dates. Locations. Enough detail to corroborate testimony instead of leaving it as just two men's word against a wealthy man's denial. We ride for Fort Benton, Cora said, as soon as the road allows it. The road allowed it 4 days later. Cora, Nathaniel, and Josiah Merritt set out together at first light, the ledger carefully wrapped and secured inside Nathaniel's saddlebag. They reached Fort Benton without incident on the evening of the second day, and the following morning, Cora stood in a federal marshal's office for the first time in her life, watching Nathaniel and Josiah lay out, methodically, everything they knew. Marshal Thomas Aldridge was a lean, quiet man, gray at the temples, who listened without interrupting. "This is serious business you're bringing me," he said finally, looking up from the pages. "Thaddeus Renner's got considerable standing in this territory. Considerable money behind him, too. That's why we brought the ledger," Josiah said steadily. "Dates. Locations. Enough to corroborate everything I'm telling you, if you're willing to check it against the actual movement of stock during those windows. And you, Miss Hartwell, what's your stake in this?" Cora held his gaze steady. "He's been trying to force me off my own land for months, lowballing my cattle sales, pressuring my accounts in town, sending someone to sabotage my water line in the night, when pressure alone didn't work fast enough for him." She paused. "My father refused to sell to him before he died. I've refused the same, every time he's asked since. I'll need to verify what's in this ledger," Aldridge said finally. "That takes time. Weeks, possibly, done properly. In the meanwhile, I'd advise considerable caution. If he gets word this investigation has started, he may move fast to cover whatever tracks he can, or worse, may move against the people, threatening to expose him." They rode back towards Stone Hollow Creek the following morning. "Weeks," Cora said, on the ride home. "That's a long while to wait, not knowing whether he catches wind of it first. We keep the basin standing together, in the meanwhile," Nathaniel said. "That's the only real protection any of us have got until Aldridge finishes his investigation." They reached Stone Hollow Creek on the evening of the 4th day since setting out. Cora had barely gotten the horses settled in the barn when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast up the basin road. Caleb Voss, riding at a pace that told her something urgent had happened. "Cordelia." He reined in hard at the gate, breathing rough. "Marsh came by my place an hour back. Dalton Marsh. What did he want? Wasn't buying cattle this time." Caleb's face was grim. "Came to warn me," he said. "Said Renner's gotten word somehow that somebody's been talking to federal authorities. Said he's furious. Said he's planning something, though Marsh claimed he didn't know exactly what." He paused. "Marsh also said he's done running errands for Renner after this. He knows already," Cora said, cold settling deep in her stomach. Aldridge said weeks, and it's been 4 days. "Something desperate," Nathaniel said grimly. "Something that doesn't wait for the investigation to finish, because if it finishes properly, he loses everything." He looked at Cora. "He comes here, directly. One last attempt to either force you out or silence whatever threat he thinks you represent." Caleb straightened in his saddle. "Then you won't face it alone. I'll ride for the others tonight. If Renner's coming here with trouble, he's going to find more waiting for him than just the two of you." He rode off into the gathering dusk. They spent the evening in careful, quiet preparation, barring the shutters, checking the rifle, and the old shotgun that had belonged to Cora's father, banking the fire low enough not to give away too much light through the cracks in the shutters. Near midnight, Cora heard it. Hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate. Nathaniel was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "2 riders," he said quietly, peering through the gap in the shutter. "Maybe 3. Coming slow." The hoofbeats stopped somewhere near the gate. A long silence followed. Then faint, carried on the night air, the unmistakable sound of metal against wood. Someone at the waterline. "They're going for the conduit," Nathaniel said, already moving toward the door. "Same as before. Except this time they mean to finish it properly." "Nathaniel, stay here. Watch the cabin." "No." Cora's voice came out sharp. "Certain. I know this ground better than anyone, in the dark. I'm not staying inside while you go out there alone." He looked at her a long moment, then nodded. Once. They slipped out the back of the cabin together, staying low, moving through shadow toward the waterline, the shotgun heavy and cold in Cora's hands. 2 figures crouched near the conduit, dark shapes against the pale snow. "That's far enough," Nathaniel said, stepping forward. The 2 figures froze, turned. One of them was a stranger, rough-featured, unfamiliar. The other, Standing slightly apart, hat pulled low, was unmistakably Thaddeus Renner himself. Mr. Cole Renner's voice carried none of its earlier smoothness. Now I'd hoped this could be settled quietly. You're on my land, Cora said. Stepping forward beside Nathaniel, the shotgun steady in her grip, despite the fear hammering hard in her chest. Trying to destroy the one thing keeping this ranch alive. There's nothing quiet left to settle. You've caused me considerable trouble, Miss Hartwell. Federal marshals, asking questions about matters that were, until very recently, entirely my own business. They're not your business when they involve stolen property, Nathaniel said. I know, Renner said quietly, that a man with sufficient resources can weather considerably more scrutiny than a woman alone, sheltering a fugitive from justice under her own roof. He's not the one who's a fugitive, Cora said. You are. Every horse you moved that wasn't rightfully yours. Every rancher you squeezed with lies and sabotage. Her voice was steady despite the cold. That ledger's already in a marshal's hands. Whatever happens tonight doesn't undo that. Something shifted in Renner's expression then, a crack in the careful composure he'd maintained through every previous encounter. Then it seems, he said, low, dangerous, that tonight has considerably less to lose by way of consequence. He moved fast, reaching for something at his belt, and Nathaniel was already moving too, throwing himself sideways, tackling Renner's companion who'd lunged forward with the metal tool still in his hand. The two men went down hard into the snow, grappling, and Cora heard Nathaniel's breath catch sharp, understanding immediately that his old shoulder injury had taken the brunt of the fall. Nathaniel! She swung the shotgun toward Renner, who'd frozen at the sound of the struggle. Don't, she said, her voice carrying clear and hard across the frozen ground. Whatever's in your hand, leave it there, she thought, fast, of everything Nathaniel had taught her over the past year, about reading a situation before it fully revealed itself, about the particular geography of danger. The ground here sloped toward the deepest drift left over from the storm. Days before, the same curving accumulation the windbreak had deliberately funneled away from the barn. Deep. Soft. The kind of snow that swallowed a man's steps entirely if he didn't know exactly where the solid ground ended and the drift began. Renner didn't know. Move toward the barn, Cora said, gesturing with the shotgun, deliberately steering him along a path that skirted the edge of the deep drift. Slowly, he obeyed, wary, watching her closely. His next step found nothing solid beneath it. He went down hard, snow swallowing him to the waist, floundering, cursing, entirely unable to gain purchase on ground that shifted and gave beneath every attempt to climb free. Behind her, the struggle between Nathaniel and Renner's companion finally resolved. A sharp cry of pain, and then Nathaniel's voice, rough but triumphant. Got him. Rope, he called. In the barn, just inside the door. Between them, breathing hard, hands trembling with cold and adrenaline both, they got both men bound. Dawn was breaking by the time hoofbeats sounded again on the Basin Road. A whole column of riders this time, Caleb Voss at the front. Caleb took in the scene at the barn, Renner and his man bound and shivering, Cora and Nathaniel exhausted but upright beside them. Looks like we're a bit late, he said, dismounting. Looks like you're right on time, Cora answered. They rode Renner and his companion into Fort Benton themselves, a whole column of Basin ranchers escorting them the entire way, and Marshal Aldridge, when they arrived, listened to the full account with an expression that shifted from grave concern to something almost like satisfaction. This considerably simplifies my investigation, he said. Attempted destruction of property, assault, trespass. On top of everything, Merritt's ledger already suggests about the stolen stock operation. He looked at Renner, seated under guard nearby, his composure entirely gone now. I'd say you've done my job for me, Miss Hartwell. I'd say I was just protecting what's mine, Cora said. The weeks that followed passed in a strange, exhausted blur. Aldridge's investigation, accelerated now by the events at Stone Hollow Creek, confirmed everything Josiah Merritt's ledger had suggested. Thaddeus Renner would stand trial in the spring, once travel through the territory became reliable again. His remaining influence over the basin evaporated almost overnight, once word spread of his arrest. Dalton Marsh never came around Stone Hollow Creek again with lowball offers. Orrin Blackwell extended credit freely, without prompting. Mara Pike brought bread more often than ever, her earlier warnings replaced by something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine friendship. By the time the last of December's cold had settled fully over the basin, Stone Hollow Creek had become something Cora hadn't quite imagined it could be. Back in September, alone and grieving with her father's chair, turned toward an empty door. Not just a ranch surviving hardship. A center. A place other outfits looked to. Now, when trouble arrived. It was on a clear, cold morning in early January that Nathaniel came to find her at the water line, where she was checking the reinforced conduit out of habit more than necessity, now that the immediate danger had passed. He'd been hauling lumber for the better part of 2 weeks, and Cora had noticed, without quite asking, that he'd been spending unusual amounts of time studying the east wall of the cabin, the ground beneath the window there. When it thaws, he said now, standing beside her at the waterline, his breath fogging in the cold morning air, I could set a sill here. East wall, where the morning light comes first. Cora looked at him. A room, you mean? I mean a room. He turned to face her fully. For whoever might need one eventually. There was no kneeling, no rehearsed speech. Just Nathaniel Cole, standing in the cold morning light with his breath fogging the air between them, offering her something far more honest than any careful proposal might have managed. If I build it, he said, quiet, steady, I'd rather build it as your husband than as your hired hand. Cora felt something catch in her throat, fierce and overwhelming, the accumulated weight of an entire year distilled suddenly into this single moment. She looked toward the east ground, where morning sunlight reached first, each day, where the crocus jar had once caught the light on that first thawing morning, nearly a year ago now. Square the foundation before you start, she said finally, her voice rough with emotion she didn't try to hide. Something broke open across his face. Relief and joy tangled together, and he crossed the distance between them, without another word, and Cora let him. They married quietly in late January, once word had spread, and the small circle of basin ranchers who'd stood beside them, through everything, insisted on gathering for the occasion, despite the cold. Reverend Asa Whitcomb performed the ceremony in the Hartwell cabin itself, the same room that had once held a dying stranger, and a chair turned toward an empty door, now filled with warmth and neighbors and the particular kind of joy that felt earned rather than simply given. Caleb and Naomi Voss stood as witnesses. Naomi fully recovered from the storm that had nearly cost her everything, her hand tight in Cora's own during the brief, simple ceremony. Josiah Merritt attended too, having stayed on in the basin these past weeks, eventually taking work with one of the smaller outfits that had joined the water-sharing arrangement. Outside, winter held the basin in its familiar grip. Inside, none of that mattered particularly much. After the small gathering had thinned and the last of the guests had ridden off into the cold, bundled and calling their farewells across the yard, Cora and Nathaniel stood together in the doorway of the cabin, watching the final riders disappear down the basin road. Feels strange, Cora admitted, calling this place ours instead of just mine. Feels right, though, doesn't it? It does. She leaned into him, the cold forgotten for a moment against the warmth of the doorway, against the fire still burning steady behind them. I keep thinking about that first night. How certain I was I'd be doing all of this alone. Every winter. Every hard season. Just me and an empty chair. You'd have managed it, Nathaniel said quietly. I don't doubt that for a second. You'd already managed a whole winter alone before I ever rode back through that gate. I would have managed it, she agreed. But I'm glad I didn't have to. He didn't answer that in words, just tightened his arm around her shoulders, and they stood there a while longer, watching the stars come out cold and clear over a basin that had, over the course of one difficult, remarkable year, become something neither of them could have built alone. Inside, the fire cracked and settled. Her father's chair, no longer angled toward an empty door, but pulled instead into a small half-circle with the two others near the stove, waited quiet in the firelight, the way it had for months now, no longer a monument to absence but simply a chair, worn and familiar, doing exactly what a chair was meant to do. Spring came to the basin the way it always did, reluctant at first, then all at once, and with it came the trial that had hung over Stone Hollow Creek since the night Renner had been dragged, indignant and furious, out of a snowdrift he'd never had any business standing in. Marshal Aldridge sent word, in early April, that the proceedings would begin the second week of May in a courthouse in Fort Benton too small for the amount of interest the case had generated across 3 counties. Cora hadn't expected to feel much of anything about it, beyond relief that the matter would finally, formally be settled. She was wrong about that, the way she'd been wrong about a number of things that year. She and Nathaniel rode in together, now husband and wife, barely 3 months married, along with Josiah Merritt and, somewhat to her surprise, Caleb Voss, who announced he wasn't about to let her sit through that courtroom without at least one familiar face in the faces, besides her own husband. The trial itself took 4 days. Cora testified on the second, standing in a small wood-paneled room that smelled of dust and lamp oil, and found that once she started speaking, the fear she'd expected to feel simply wasn't there. She told it plainly, the way she'd learned to tell most things that year. The letter her father had refused to answer, the lowballed cattle, the account pushed forward without explanation, the waterline torn open in the dark twice the second time by Renner's own hand. Renner's lawyer, a sharp-featured man from Helena, tried twice to suggest that a woman managing a ranch alone, with an unmarried man under her roof at the time, might have motives of her own for wanting to see a wealthy neighbor discredited. Cora answered both attempts with the same flat, unhurried honesty she'd have used on a cattle buyer trying to talk her price down. "I've got no motive beyond wanting to keep what's mine," she said, "and wanting my neighbors to keep what's theirs. If that troubles the defense, I expect it troubles them because it happens to be the truth." The jury returned its verdict on the 4th day. Guilty on every count that mattered. The stolen stock operation laid bare in exhaustive, damning detail by Josiah's ledger and the corroborating testimony of 2 other former hands who'd come forward once word of the trial spread. Guilty, too, on the charges tied directly to Stone Hollow Creek, the sabotage, the trespass, the attempted intimidation of a federal witness. Thaddeus Renner was sentenced to 15 years at the territorial prison, his remaining land holdings seized and auctioned to settle the considerable debts uncovered once his finances were properly examined, debts that had apparently been quietly consuming his fortune for longer than anyone in the basin had suspected. Cora watched him led out of the courtroom in irons, his composure entirely gone, replaced by something small and diminished that bore little resemblance to the smooth, dangerous man who'd once sat his horse at her gate, offering generous sums for everything she loved. She felt, watching him go, considerably less satisfaction than she'd expected to. Mostly she felt tired. And beneath the tiredness, something quieter and more durable. Something that felt, she decided on the long ride home, very much like peace. The auctioned parcels of Renner's land, once the debts were settled, included 2 sections that bordered the deep spring system directly, ground that had been part of his original ambition to control every property sitting over that unfailing water. Cora, Caleb, and 3 other outfits from the water-sharing arrangement pooled what resources they could and bid on the smaller of the 2 parcels together, an unusual arrangement that the auctioneer had clearly never processed before and took some convincing to allow. They won it. Split the deed 6 ways, with careful legal language drawn up by a lawyer in Fort Benton to ensure the water access it contained could never again be bought up whole by any single ambitious man with deep enough pockets. "Your father would have liked this," Nathaniel said, standing beside her at the edge of the newly shared parcel, one warm afternoon in late May, watching Caleb's nephew Robert wade into the shallows with the particular delight of a boy who'd grown up rationing every drop. "He would have," Cora agreed, "though I expect he'd have found some reason to grumble about the paperwork first." Nathaniel laughed, low and easy, a sound that had become as familiar to her now as the wind through the willow. Josiah Merritt stayed on with the Hoyt outfit through that summer, working steady, quiet, careful, a man rebuilding a life one honest season at a time. And by autumn, he'd become enough a fixture of the basin that nobody thought twice when Constance Hoyt started bringing him along to the shared gatherings at the trough, the 2 of them standing a little closer together than the work strictly required. A small, quiet story unfolding at its own pace, the way most good things in that basin seemed to. Caleb's rebuilt windbreak held through its first full winter without a single complaint, gapped and deliberate exactly the way Cora had taught him, and he took to bringing it up whenever a new rancher joined the water-sharing arrangement, holding court at the trough with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd been wrong once, admitted it plainly, and never had cause to regret the admission. The seasons turned, as they always did in the basin, summer settling warm and generous over land that had, only 2 years before, seemed to hold nothing but hardship and grief. The following winter, nearly 2 years to the day since a screaming horse had first carried a half-frozen stranger to this gate, another storm crossed the Judith Basin after dark. Smaller than the one that had tested everything that first November, but real enough to send Cora through her familiar evening ritual, banking the stove, checking the shutters, running her fingers along the northwest sill for cold air, the way she'd done every winter night since her father built this cabin. 2 coats hung beside the door now instead of one. Nathaniel's gloves dried from a peg beneath the rope that had, over the past year, become as permanent a fixture of the cabin as the stove itself. Cora's hat rested above them, exactly where it had always rested, except now it rested beside something instead of alone. Outside, wind moved gentle through the willow windbreak, a sound Cora had come to find almost peaceful now. Evidence of protection, doing exactly what it had been built to do. 2 winters earlier, a screaming horse had carried a dying stranger to that doorway. Refusing to abandon him, even when running, would have been easier, safer, simpler. By the following spring, he had ridden back because he chose to, because something about this land, this woman, this particular quiet corner of the Judith Basin, had settled into him in a way he hadn't expected and couldn't quite walk away from. Now another winter had come and gone, tested everything they'd built together, and judged it worthy. Nathaniel crossed the room and nudged a piece of wood closer to the hearth with his boot, the same small unconscious gesture he'd made 100 times over the past year, the kind of small domestic movement that had, somewhere along the way, stopped feeling like something borrowed and started feeling like something that belonged to him. Cora poured coffee into one mug, then another. She placed the second one on the table, steam rising soft against the firelight, and this time, unlike that first lonely evening back in November so long ago, she didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess the gesture, didn't pour it back into the pot and set the bowl alone on an upper shelf. She simply sat down across from him, 2 mugs of coffee steaming between them, the fire cracking warm against the walls that had held through everything this land and this year had thrown against them. Somewhere beyond the basin, in a jail cell awaiting spring and trial, Thaddeus Renner sat with nothing left to threaten anyone with. His empire of quiet pressure and stolen stock had crumbled the moment a ranch he'd underestimated, refused, simply and repeatedly, to break. Somewhere across the basin, ranchers, who'd once stood alone against every hardship this land offered, now rode fence lines together, shared water freely, checked in on each other's herds without needing to be asked. A community rebuilt from the ashes of exactly the kind of fear Renner had once tried to exploit. And at Stone Hollow Creek, beneath ground that no drought had ever managed to touch, the deep spring ran on exactly as it always had. Constant, unbroken, giving generously to everyone who came to it with honest need, exactly the way Elijah Hartwell had always intended it to, exactly the way his daughter had fought, through blizzard and sabotage and threat, to make certain it always would. The fire settled low. The storm outside gentled gradually into the ordinary business of a Montana winter night. And in the small cabin at the center of it all, 2 mugs sat together on the table, both of them being used now, both of them exactly where they belonged. Sometimes on quiet evenings, Cora still found herself glancing toward the peg by the door, where her father's coat had hung all through that first hard winter. She'd moved it eventually, that following spring, folded it with care, and set it in the wooden chest alongside his other few belongings. Not because the grief had finished its work, but because she'd come to understand, slowly, that keeping a coat on a peg wasn't the same as keeping a man alive, and that Elijah Hartwell would rather have seen his daughter living fully in the house he'd built than standing forever in the doorway of her own mourning. She kept his knife instead, the one she'd used that first night to cut frozen cloth from a stranger's ruined leg, and carried it now the way he'd once carried it, tucked into her boot without a second thought, an old habit passed down and taken up again, without either of them ever discussing it directly. Some inheritances came that way, she'd learned. Not through wills or ledgers or careful instruction, but through hands doing the same small tasks in the same small ways, year after year, until the doing itself became the inheritance, more lasting than any single object could have been. The ranch endured, the way ranches in that basin always had and always would, through drought and flood, and the particular grinding patience of a Montana winter, through good years and lean ones, through the ordinary business of cattle and fence and water that never once cared whether the people tending it were happy or heartbroken, married or alone. But it endured now as something more than one woman's stubborn inheritance. It endured as the quiet center of a basin that had learned, through hardship neither chosen nor wanted, exactly what it meant to stand together instead of scattered and afraid. And that lesson, Cora understood, watching her husband work the last light out of another ordinary evening, would likely outlast every one of them, pass down the same patient way everything worthwhile eventually was, through hands, through habit, through a spring that never failed, giving generously to anyone who came to it with honest need, exactly as it always had, and exactly as it always would. There would be other storms, of course, other hard seasons, other troubles neither of them could yet name or predict, the way there always were on land like this, land that gave generously but never easily, never without asking something honest in return. Cora had learned that lesson long before Nathaniel Cole ever rode through her gate, and she suspected she'd go on learning it in one form or another, for as long as she drew breath on Stone Hollow Creek. But she'd learned something else that year, too. Something she carried now the way she carried her father's knife, close and constant and entirely her own. That a person could be broken open by grief and loss, and still, somehow, build something worth protecting from the wreckage. That stubbornness, properly aimed, was its own kind of strength. The same strength that had once refused a wealthy man's letter without explanation, the same strength that had once dragged a dying stranger across a frozen yard rather than let the storm decide his fate for him. And that sometimes, if a person was patient enough and stubborn enough and willing enough to let a little help in when it came riding up the basin road, the very thing that nearly broke you could become, in time, the thing that finally made you whole. That was the whole of it, in the end. Not a fortune, not a courtroom victory, though that had mattered too. Just a ranch, a marriage, a basin full of neighbors who had learned to trust one another again, and a spring running clean and constant beneath it all, exactly the way it always had, exactly the way it always would, for as long as anyone stayed to tend it. Total word count, approximately 24,850 words.